Bien, eh bien, on va démarrer.
Right, we're ready to start now, I think.
Please take your headphones because it's going to be bilingual. Apparently everybody. Reza, are you? So. Okay.
Right then. So, to start with, my role is to welcome you here to France Stratégie. Obviously, personally, I'm delighted to see that on the 10th anniversary that we're celebrating, we've been able to organize this seminar. I think at France Stratégie, it's very important for us, along with Bruegel, to organize this panel and think forward a little bit about economic monetary union, because this event is focusing on the question of the future of economic and monetary union. What are the next steps? And now, some people are impatient, but sometimes experience has shown that you have to go with the flow. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow. So we've decided that this afternoon we'll be talking about both the next few weeks and months, but also a more distant horizon. I'll stop there because it's Jean-Claude Triget, president of Bruegel, whose 10th anniversary we're celebrating, who will give the introductory statement. Thank you, Jean. Thank you for your hospitality. I'm delighted to be here in what's physically quite a small space, but mentally there's quite a lot of brain power in this small room. So thank you for organizing this series of seminars.
From time to time, because I understand that we have the streaming all over Europe, so I will utilize the two languages. So first of all, let me say that it's a great privilege to chair the board of directors of Bruegel. The founding values, and you know those founding values better than anybody, Jean, independence, professional integrity, objectivity, excellence in analysis, and also excellence, if I may, which is very specific to Bruegel, in the dynamics of the relationship with the policy makers. So we have a think tank which is, from that standpoint, quite remarkable, I have to say, and recognized as remarkable by external observers. I take advantage of the fact that we have an occasion of exchanging information to remind, I guess that practically all of us know that, but not necessarily those who are looking in the streaming process. Perhaps you don't know that after 10 years, even 9 years, the University of Pennsylvania was considering Bruegel as number 2 in the non-US international think tank in the world, number 5 of all think tanks in the world, including the US think tank, number 3 as regards the think tank which had the most significant impact on policy makers worldwide, and number 3 as international economic policy think tank in the world. So this ranking is very difficult to explain after such a small span of time, I have to say. And I would say, how can you expect to be recognized as a credible, authoritative institution, non-institution, if I may, think tank, with such a small span of time? How can it be that Bruegel attains also this ranking with only a few eminent scholars? I counted, under the control of Guntram, 11 resident scholars, 3 visiting scholars, 19 non-resident scholars, and 8 research assistants. Let me say that it changes, of course, every day, so it is the order of magnitude. It's not necessarily the precise figures. And the only explanation I have is that we have an excellent staff, obviously, remarkable. I can judge that as a member of the board of directors, excellent founding fathers, and I have to mention, of course, Mario Monti, Jean, and Mario founded the institution. I have to mention Leszek Balcerowicz, who was the successor of Mario, and I have to mention Guntram as the successor of Jean, which was not that an easy succession. And I'm so happy of having presided over the board of directors which decided that. So bravo, if I may, and I think it was worth for me mentioning that, and mentioning, of course, the fact that we have such an authority that we also have to keep up to this level of ranking and of authority in circumstances that remain extraordinarily difficult and demanding. It is extraordinary that we have this meeting at the very day where there are meditation within Europe on what to do with Greece. And I have also to mention the fact that history in the making, which is the characteristic of Europe, European Union, and the euro area, is always demanding, and we should not be surprised that we have a lot of challenges permanently to cope with, because we are in this universe, which is particularly, again, demanding, because we are very bold. Very often, when I am abroad in the US or in Asia or anywhere in the world, I am struck by the fact that there is a big difference between the vision of Europe and of the boldness of the euro area, the single currency area. Seen from the rest of the world, you see only the boldness. And you say, well, how can you be bold enough to engage in such an extraordinary historic endeavor, which has never been tried before? And of course, they draw some kind of negativity from this, what they considered incredible boldness. And they say it's not surprising that you have difficulty permanently. Seen from Europe, I would say, understanding is totally different. We have the feeling that we are deepening and deepening the European construction, which started 65 years ago, and that there is nothing but absolutely normal in the endeavor that we are pursuing. So we don't see the boldness of our endeavor. And we seem from time to time to be surprised to see that we have a lot of challenges. I think both are right. The observers, the friends in Asia, America, and Africa are right to say, you're extremely bold. Don't be surprised if you have a lot of difficulty and a lot of challenges. And we are probably right to tell them, look, you don't understand. There is an underlying historical endeavor which is very profound, very, very important, and which explains why we have the level of resilience that we could see, in particular during the most recent period, because I dare say even the day where discussions on Greece are taking place, we are experiencing the worst crisis in the advanced economies since World War II. In my opinion, could have been the worst crisis in the advanced economy since World War I, had we not taken very swift and bold also decisions all over the advanced economy, both by central banks and by governments and parliaments. In these extraordinarily difficult circumstances, we were 15 countries in the euro area at the time of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. The 15 countries that were in the euro area at the time of Lehman Brothers are still there. And I dare say that my personal assumption is that it is not at all for sure that we will be 14 only out of the 15. So we will see what happens, but that is my intuition. But that being said, 4 new countries entered in the crisis after Lehman Brothers, as we all know, Slovakia and 3 Baltic states. So we were 15, we are now at the moment I'm speaking 19. And it was and it still is the worst crisis, the worst financial crisis ever over a century of the advanced economy. It tells us something on resilience of this concept of the single currency area. Now let me turn to today's seminar, which I have the duty to introduce. We will have first a panel on the fiscal issues. Is it necessary for the euro area to engage in a new framework, to have a fiscal capacity? What would be the fiscal union concept that would be the best one? And there I have to say we are privileged with an exceptional panel. You could not dream a better panel to discuss that with Jean Pisani-Ferry, Jacob von Weizsäcker, which is MP and member of, I know very well if I may, of the Commission of Economic Affairs and Monetary Affairs. We have Daniel Cohen, professor in the École Normale Supérieure, Reza Moghadam, vice president in charge of global financial markets, Morgan Stanley, and my dear friend, Philippe Mechtat, President, Academy of Research and Higher Education, and who has occupied all the important jobs, if I may, in Europe successively, and with whom we worked a lot. So I think it's fantastic. Then we have a second panel with the chair being Guntram Wolf on the structural convergence, how to attain structural convergence, and again, exceptional panel. We are extremely privileged. Stéphane Mayer, member of the Bureau of the BDI, Philippe Martin, professor of economy at Sciences Po Paris, Jean-Michel Six, chief economist of Europe at Standard & Poor's, and Eli Cohen, research director, CNRS. So, again, the issues at stake are some of the most important ones. Let me make one comment on the fiscal issue, one comment on the structural convergence issue, and conclude with a call for democratic accountability. On the fiscal issue, I would say personally that it seems to me, of course, that it's very important that we deepen the fiscal union. A lot of concepts have been envisaged. They are all very, very important. They turn around having some kind of budget for the euro area, a growing budget for the euro area, and perhaps concentrating on the part of the budget, the concept of the budget that could be a good amortizer for asymmetric shocks in order to facilitate the cohesion of the euro area. I fully agree with that. Still, I draw your attention to the fact that it is very unlikely that we will have really a big budget of the size of the United States of America, and that we have to know. So we have to know that there are dimensions, in my own vision, of the fiscal union that are not necessarily imitating other federations, which, again, would rely upon the sentiment that Italy can be equivalent to Florida and Germany equivalent to California, which we know is not the case. Even in the US, I draw your attention on the fact that academic research has more or less suggested that for resisting and countering asymmetric shocks, the fiscal channel is not the dominant channel. I was myself very, very struck by the fact, and this goes very much along some of the Bruegel research, the credit channel and the risk-sharing channel are perhaps significantly more important than the budget channel, which gives, of course, a lot of credit to banking union and capital markets union, which again has been called by Bruegel, in my opinion, very, very wisely since a long period of time, in particular by the work that you did yourself and Nicolas Véron did. So that being said, it seems to me that it doesn't mean necessarily that we should not, on top of what is envisaged as regards the growing up of the start, the birth of a fiscal budget for the euro area, it seems to me that perhaps, and then you know my marotte, Guntram, I would suggest that we should have a Stability and Growth Pact which would be more democratic, which could solve problems which look unsolvable through what I call from time to time the activation of a fiscal federation by exception, namely when there is a disagreement between a particular country and the institutions of Europe on what should be done to be in line with the requirement of the Stability and Growth Pact or in line with the recovery and adjustment program. And of course, what we see in Greece is also a case in point. In my opinion, when there is a strong disagreement between one particular country and the institutions, all institutions, because it would be a disagreement between that particular country and the Council and the Commission and the Council, then I would call for the European Parliament, and I say that knowing that, of course, it is very bold also as a proposal. I would call for the European Parliament, restricted, of course, to the MPs of the euro area, to have the last word, because it seems to me that it would be democratic, it would be unchallengeable from the legitimacy standpoint, it would be respecting the subsidiarity principle, because we would apply that only when a country challenging the position of the central institution. And of course, it would be operational because a new treaty would have said the last word is for the representative of the people. And looking at what happens in Greece today, I think that this proposal I made in 2012 perhaps deserves more attention. Second point on, very rapidly, on structural convergence, where I will only say that on top of all the dimensions of structural convergence, and we have an exceptional panel there, Guntram, on top of that, I would mention again what I have observed myself. The main problem is not, unfortunately, convergence, it's divergence. It is, unfortunately, in a single currency area, the fact that the competitive channel does not function at all as we thought, and that you could pretty well have sustained divergences as regards relative competitiveness between the various member countries. And that, of course, has been observed dramatically, I have to say, since the beginning of the euro area. We had too naive a confidence in market economies and in the competitive channel and on the automatic, I would say, correction of growing imbalances as regards unit labor cost, competitive indicators, current account deficits, and so forth. Now the MIP is supposed to cope with that macroeconomic imbalance procedure. I consider the macroeconomic imbalance procedure as important as the SGP, as important as the SGP. Personally, I don't suggest that this sentiment is shared by all of us, does not seem to be understood as very important by a lot of public opinion, and doesn't seem necessarily to be understood by the central institution of Europe as also very important. But I draw your attention on the fact that we could see those sustained, persistent divergences in the Eurogroup over the years. And really, if we have not the will to take seriously the MIP framework, we could have a lot of problems. That is my own remark and my only remark, I would say, on this particular point on structural convergence. But again, not to say that innovation, creativity, labor productivity, total factor productivity, and are not of the essence also. Now, let me conclude. I said already that in some exceptional cases, we should have a procedure for arbitrage that would be perhaps fully democratic. I really trust that democratic accountability is absolutely essential at this stage of the European construction. Of course, the Commission is fully democratic, has the confidence of the European Parliament. He's appointed by democratic heads of government, head of state and government. Of course, the heads of state and government are democratic. Of course, we are full of democracy. But the direct democratic accountability at the level of the European Union as a whole and of the euro area as a whole particularly seems to me still lacking, because the only, I would say, ultimate decisions in all our democracies are taken by the representative of the people. And, that is, for me, very important. I am amazed to see that the European Parliament is not considered from that standpoint still now as decisive. Maybe we should reflect more on the idea of joining European national parliaments and the European Parliament. I would be open to any solution. I have a preference for the European Parliament. And to conclude, laissez-moi dire, parce que
let me say, because I think this is very important, that I give this a view. In this period of dramatic recession that we had in 2007, 8 and 9, and 2010 as well, where it really was a deep crisis with an epicenter in Europe, and 2011, which is when I left the ECB, throughout that period, I met the European Parliament at least 6 times a year, sometimes more, or when there were informal meetings. And it's in the European Parliament that I felt the pulse of Europe beating, to be perfectly honest. That's where, for me, we had the beating heart of Europe. My personal experience was that, much more than anywhere else. And it was my feeling, because we were carrying the burden of the epicenter of the crisis on our shoulder. It was always my feeling that there was an excellent understanding of the systemic risks and the systemic challenges that we were facing at the time. That was the atmosphere in the European Parliament. I'll stop there because I think that's the end of my relatively generous speaking time, and I'll now go to the first panel.
Chairing the first panel.
So I chair the first panel. Donald Cohen thought it was at 6 o'clock, so he'll be coming a bit later. However, let's take 5 minutes, because we have got 5 minutes, just to thank you, Jean-Claude, for giving us this reminder of the political and democratic aspects of this crisis. It's true that in your statement, which I think was for the Aachen Prize, wasn't it? You talked about federalism by exception. Imagine a situation where there would be a strong dispute or disagreement between the authorities of a country and the union. And you were wondering about what sort of procedure would make the union's decisions legitimate. And I think that is the issue we're facing today. What's at stake at the moment is not the subject of today's seminar, but we're all aware of it, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it during the breaks. Quite clearly, first and foremost, whenever the economic questions come up, it's that political and democratic dimension that come to the fore. So thank you once again for saying what you did about Bruegel. What we've done, I was talking to Guntram just now, and saying that we've been very lucky. And I said, luck is the dividend of sweat, as they say. So we've also been working hard, but I think if we were to describe Bruegel in a nutshell, what is behind this organization is, to a large extent, boldness. The feeling that something had to be done, that we really need to come to grips with the underlying questions, and we needed to challenge the set of ideas that seemed perfectly obvious, taken for granted by everyone. Now, if Bruegel has been as successful as it seems today, it's because there weren't many of us, but we were all like-minded. And who was the first one to be recruited? After Nicolas Véran, was it Antoine? I can't remember. Okay, so it was the second. But Jacob then came along and said, I'm joining this organization because I want to change Europe. And that was the spirit behind this team. And when I took a trip to Washington at the time Bruegel was being set up, I went to the Center for Global Development, and I remember talking with academics there, and we said, why do you work here in particular? And one said, well, it's very simple, because we want to change the world. And maybe Bruegel isn't quite that ambitious, but I think this sort of motivation is vital to the success of this kind of setup, the feeling that nothing is impossible. There's no barrier to what you can think about in any case. So Guntram, maybe you, and then we'll go on to the panel.
Well, I think it's difficult to add anything to what has been said, but it's of course great to have this conference here to discuss. I think one of the central issues that has kept us, and not just us, many people, but also Bruegel's researchers busy in the last years, namely economic and monetary union. But I do want to mention also that we are not only doing our 10th anniversary conference here in Paris. In fact, we do a tour d'Europe, so we go to different capitals. In fact, Monday we were in Warsaw, Varsovie, for a conference, high-level conference on the digital union. And I do think it's important that in our European discussion, we don't lose sight of also the broader issues that are happening around the world, and don't get lost only in, let's say, the details of the Greek drama. And of course, it's more than details, but it's very fundamental issues. But we should also be aware of the broader issues, such as the rapid global change, the shift of power towards the east, the shift of economic activity to the east, to Asia in particular, the rapid technological transformation of our societies, and the impact that has on business, the impact that has on governments, the impact that has on the European Union. So just to say, we have 6 major conferences around Europe on all of these different topics. In all of our member states, so we have 18 member states at the moment. We have smaller workshops, smaller discussions about many, many different topics. But we thought in Paris, and given that Jean is here, and we've worked also both quite a bit together on all of these issues, we thought we'd discuss really economic and monetary union. And so I very much look forward to our discussion today. And I think that that's all I wanted to say for now, and I look forward to a very good discussion.
Merci Guntram. Donc passons.
Thank you, Guntram. So let's go on to our first panel, which is on fiscal union, fiscal capacity. This is a subject where for quite some time now, observers, American observers, said this will never work here. Monetary union will not work without fiscal union. And this has now become part and parcel of European terminology about fiscal capacity, in particular the report of the 4 presidencies, I think 3 years ago. And the advantage of this kind of term is that you can basically interpret it as you wish. Fiscal capacity means different things to different people. So I thought that for this panel, the best thing would be to start by asking the members if we need fiscal capacity and what it is. So I produced a questionnaire, and I'll give you the results. They'll be up on the screen. This is the questionnaire then. So it says...
Il y a need de fiscal capacity. Donc la réponse était oui ou non. Ensuite, c'était de dire pourquoi faire, what to do, what should be the...
So what should be the purpose of a possible fiscal capacity?
Aggregate stabilization over the cycle. That's the idea of simply playing the role, the macro role that a budget normally plays. Provide more specifically contra-cyclical transfers, contra-cyclical stabilization among the participating countries. To supplement monetary policy in the hopefully rare case when monetary policy is ineffective. The idea is to be able to use this fiscal capacity for discretionary fiscal policy purposes, especially when monetary policy cannot be playing its role because, for example, it's at a zero lower bound. And finally, to serve as a backstop for financial risk sharing. So 4 possible purposes. And then the next question is, what form should a possible fiscal capacity take? And then I have, I think, 6 possible forms. And for each of them, it was asked to indicate whether it would be desirable, possible, or undesirable. So a Eurozone budget, an unemployment insurance scheme mechanism. So that could be part of a budget, but the budget would essentially be consisting of an unemployment insurance mechanism. Third, an output gap-based macro transfer scheme, so that would mimic the role of a national budget, but simply using the output gap as a way to trigger automatic transfers to countries depending on their position in the cycle, not as a byproduct of a budget, but as a directly designed scheme for that purpose. Then the 3 last one are of a different nature. So borrowing capacity, a joint borrowing capacity that could be activated by qualified majority voting. So there would be a decision, a joint decision to borrow and to spend. So that would not be automatic as opposed to the previous scheme. That would be something focusing on the discretionary side. Third, that would be the same, but that would rely on national instead of joint borrowing capacities. That would be a sort of joint decision on the national budgetary policies. So there would be a way to, to have a sort of double key or to have a joint decision on the national budget. So a coordination mechanism, but with teeth. And finally, a beefed up ESM, so using essentially the existing European stability mechanism as a fiscal capacity, but increasing its capacity to borrow and perhaps the scope of what it could do. So these were the questions, and here are the answers. So on whether we need a fiscal capacity, unanimity. So perhaps it's a selection bias. But there will be little debate on that. So, next slide is about what should be the purpose of a fiscal capacity. And here you see some differences. So the possible answers were yes and no. So on aggregate stabilization, everybody thinks it should be done, but Jacob. On contra-cyclical transfers across countries, everybody agrees. And then on the last 2, there are disagreements. Reza opposes the role of a supplement to monetary policy, so discretionary role in this respect. And Philippe opposes, or at least doubts, if I understand well what he said, the possibility of using the fiscal capacity either as a supplement to monetary policy or as a backstop for financial risk sharing. Then the question is how? So how should it work? And that's the last slide. So here there were 3 possibilities, desirable, undesirable, and possible. So some did not answer all the questions. Some answered all the questions, but Daniel is coming and he will be explain why there are so many gray zones in the table. But here again, you see that there are differences. So a Eurozone budget seems to be something everybody would consider desirable, which doesn't mean everybody considers it's feasible. Unemployment insurance, there are different views, with Philippe especially having a reluctance to it. Output gap, you're going to explain. Yeah. Difficult to implement. Okay, but each of you will have the 7 minutes he needs to explain the votes. So then on output gap-based stabilization mechanism, same. I mean, the desirability for Reza and difficult to implement for Philippe. Now, on the QMV activated borrowing, possible for Philippe, desirable for Reza, the others didn't say anything. And finally, on QMV, coordination based on QMV, Jakob disagrees, and there is no strong support. On the beefed up ESM, Jakob agrees, and there is no strong support. So here are the views. Et maintenant, je propose que vous ayez chacun 7 minutes pour des explications de vote.
What I suggest now is that you will take 7 minutes to explain why you voted the way you did, not a general presentation, but tell us why you voted this way to these particular questions.
Thank you. Let me take 1 minute, if you don't count it part of my 7 minutes, to first of all say that I'm delighted to be here because I've been a strong supporter of your organization ever since it was set up, and I've been truly delighted to see how successful you have made this enterprise. And I've seen it grow from a focus on analytical depth at the beginning that really Jean should be credited for it. I have seen you engage with policymakers. Jean-Claude Trichet mentioned this. This has been a huge strength of Bruegel, to bring policymakers and those who are affected by policy and those who have an interest and academic interest in it. And that has been an enormous part of your success. And I have seen it also become more transparent and an institution which engages in the public policy. And I've seen that grow particularly on the Jugendtram. Almost any day there is something interesting, there is a tweet from you, or there is a video, or there is a short blog. And so the institution has become stronger over time and very effective in terms of public policy debate. I've also seen you grow internationally. I think I've been to your events in outside Europe, in China and in India in particular. And so Bruegel is really also a global force. So I'm delighted to be here, and I think both of you need to be particularly congratulated. Now, this doesn't mean I'm not going to answer my...
So I reset the clock.
Thank you. Let me now, instead of going through questions by questions, I think it is useful to also put it in a little bit of a perspective as why I gave the answers that I did. I think just a couple of minutes of background. If one goes to the when Maastricht and the fiscal frameworks were born, it is quite striking that basically there was a huge fear of fiscal indiscipline. And if you look at the, to me, there were at the beginning of the crisis, there were 3 concepts that dominated discussions on the eve of the crisis. On the eve of the crisis, countries were against bailout, so there was a no bailout, which was part of the Maastricht criteria, part of the Maastricht thinking, if you wish. The concept of no haircuts, no PSI, and it's a shame that Jean-Claude has left because he felt particularly strongly on that front. and the concept of no exit. Now, the first two have been broken. The third one has fortunately not, but it is under strain. And if you go back to the thinking in Maastricht, it was the fiscal discipline which was the glue to hold those three together. And I think what I would say that a crisis has shown us that it was not so much fiscal discipline, but despite the fact that I now work in the financial sector, I have to say financial indiscipline that was at the heart of the crisis. And rightly, the focus of policymakers has been on dealing with the financial indiscipline. They have also reinforced fiscal discipline, which I will argue has been somewhat counterproductive. But let me explain that. Now, I think there has been a lot of progress in Europe in terms of dealing with the financial indiscipline. For example, we have the new SSM system in place. We have the process in terms of bail-in and to generate discipline in the financial sector. There is a focus has shifted to look at the macroeconomic imbalances, which are necessary. Fiscal imbalance is only one of them. A lot of more focus on current account and external indiscipline, which was not there before the crisis, and also mechanisms like the resolution mechanism of the banking system. To me, all of these go in the right direction in terms of addressing the causes of the problem, which was financial indiscipline rather than fiscal indiscipline. But I did say that fiscal policy, in a way, has been somewhat pro-cyclical. But there are two problems I see. One, lack of credibility of the fiscal framework, and I just want to illustrate this. These set of numbers on the screen, these are all the general government balances for the 10 years since EMU was set up. Don't worry, I'll make it easier to see what has happened. Now, those who met the Maastricht targets are in green, and those who did not are in red. So, according to this, only 3 countries were able to consistently meet the Maastricht criteria. But we have to go one step beyond this. If you look at structural balances, these are the structural balances for the 10 years after EMU was set up. And if you put the cutoff as the minus 0.5, which is now considered as the limit in the new rules that have been accepted by everybody, this is what happened. So nobody met them. I think you have one country, Finland, which almost met it every year, but no country in Europe met, not just consistently, but in the totality, the fiscal rules. So there is a...
Sorry, back in 2009, you were advocating fiscal expansion, right?
Correct.
In your capacity. So
I'm
how
not
can you blame the country for having done what you advocated?
I'm not blaming. I'm giving the facts. Because in fact, what I'm saying is that, in part, what I'm coming to is that it is probably unwise to have the same targets, the same framework for everybody, irrespective of where the economies are and what their problems are and what the debt is. I think that was my punchline, which you forced me to say. Now, so there is an issue of credibility of the targets, and then secondly, the wisdom of the targets in terms of what is needed macroeconomically. Now, again, to put it in a broader context, not just in the fiscal context, going to my original theme for this and why I gave the answers that I did, I think what is it that would strengthen the union? Fiscal is part of it, but what are the, given the progress that has been done? One is the progress that has been done on the financial discipline. A lot of progress, but I see 2 areas which are related to the fiscal area, and they are exactly the answers that I gave in the questionnaire. One area where there hasn't been progress, it's a fiscal issue, but it's also a financial discipline issue, is the idea of direct recapitalization of the banking system. If you go back to 2012, the leader's statement was very strong that there needed to be a mechanism for direct recapitalization. Now, this is, in essence, a fiscal backstop, but done for financial reasons. And that, to me, is still missing. It was very strongly expressed in 2012, but the way it has been designed is such that not to ever be used, and hence you see my answer on that. And second, the issue of, again, from a financial discipline point of view, the issue of a common backstop. Now, a common backstop has been put in place. To me, given the size of the financial sector, given not just the size of the markets, given the size of the banking sector and the individual banks in the Eurozone, again, it's quite inadequate. Again, hence my answer in terms of fiscal backs. So it's a fiscal issue, but it is done for financial stability. The third, counter-cyclical support. Now, and I think one lesson I take from the crisis in terms of my own involvement when I was at the fund is when you look at the design of all the reform measures that were made, we underestimated the social impact of the fiscal consolidation. And I think in terms of social stability, it will be important to have counter-cyclical measures. And sometimes those counter-cyclical measures are difficult at country level. Take the Greece example, that's an extreme example, but look at Spain or look at other countries where unemployment is extremely high. I think it would help the cohesion and sustainability of the Eurozone if you have counter-cyclical central support, and hence, again, the answer I've given. Just to put it in a broader context, I completely agree with what Jean-Claude said in terms of broader issues. For the stability of the Eurozone, macroeconomic imbalances are incredibly important, but what I see at the moment is they cannot really be enforced. And even when they are put on the table, the political pressure to turn a blind eye on it is very high. Look at the macroeconomic imbalances that exist right now, not just in terms of fiscal, but also in terms of external imbalances, and it is not really a focus of discussion. Deeper capital markets, I think this is incredibly key, and it is helpful where Europe is going, but it is, to me, slow and it's not sufficiently focused. And finally, structural reforms. Everyone talks about it, but there is no mechanism in Europe to not just monetary, but also enforce it. And I think Europe needs something along those lines too. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you it started a bit of a sort of undisciplined remarks, but it ended with clear answers and explanations to my questions, so I congratulate you for that. Next is on the order. It was not strictly, well, Daniel is not here, so I suggest we go to Jakob or to Philippe, whichever. Philippe.
If you want. Thank you. First of all, I would like to say that I fully agree with Jean-Claude Trichet's remarks. The first and the last remark. The first, congratulations to Bruegel for the quality of the work. Really, I know many think tanks in Europe. I don't hesitate to say that in the economic and financial field is the best. I don't say it's the best academic unit, but it's the best think tank. I mean, the mission of a think tank is to bring concrete proposals to decision makers. And I think that Bruegel does that quite well. And I fully agree with the last remark of Jean-Claude Trichet about the need to reinforce democratic accountability. If we go in the direction, we all agree that we would need a euro area budget. It would mean, one way or another, a transfer of powers from the national level to EU institutions. The necessary counterpart is a democratic accountability. And I agree with Jean-Claude Trichet that probably this is the role of the European Parliament. So I stop here. I come now to my answer. Indeed, I think that we need a euro area budget for absorbing or helping countries to absorb asymmetric shocks. It's all the more necessary in EMU because other corrective mechanism does not play as well in Europe than, for example, in the US. Labor mobility is still very slow. Capital movements, we have seen that can provoke a refragmentation of financial markets. We have structural rigidities which would prevent the adjustment through prices. So I think really we need a mechanism, an asymmetric shock absorbing mechanism. Now, there are at least 3 questions to be solved. What would trigger the intervention of the euro area budget? What would be the amount of the intervention, and how could this budget be funded? First of all, should the intervention of this euro area budget be automatic or based on discretion? Ideally, I think it would be better to have some discretion to address specific shocks in a targeted way. But discretion would imply a strong decision-making center, which would be able to take decisions quickly and which would be controlled by a democratic watchdog. This would require some important treaty change. And I don't see the possibility of treaty change in the foreseeable future. So I think that we have to think about some kind of ex-ante rules, some automatic stabilizers, which would trigger the intervention of this budget. We can think of different indicators. I refer to the excellent work of Guntram Wolf in this respect. He suggested several possibilities. One of the possible indicators seems difficult to implement. It's output gaps. That's the reason why I made some reservation, because, as you say, Guntram, in theory, is quite appealing, but it's very difficult to implement. And I noticed that you give the example of Greece. The estimate of the Greek output gap vary considerably. For the same year, 2011, you go from 4% of PIB as output gap. This was the estimate of the Commission in 2010. In 2011, it was 8%, and in 2012, for the year 2011, it was more than 10%. So it's difficult to use this as a basis, but I think we can think of other indicators. It could be the rate of unemployment, or to be more precise, the rate of unemployment of less than 12 months to capture the cyclical component of unemployment. So I think we could use this type of indicator to trigger the intervention of the euro area budget. Second question, what would be the amount of the intervention? The amount should be high enough to provide a real relief to the country in shock. So this would reduce its borrowing requirements. This would make its fiscal policy less pro-cyclical. But the amount should not be too high to ensure that the intervention does not create an incentive to artificially prolong the situation which was at the origin of the intervention. So, for example, the euro area budget could pay 70% of the additional expenditures in unemployment benefits, but this means that there would still be 30% in charge of the national budget. So I think you would avoid the temptation to artificially increase the number of beneficiaries. By the way, that's the reason why I have some reservation about an unemployment insurance scheme, because, of course, it's a very appealing idea to have a common unemployment insurance scheme. This would give a very strong signal to the citizens. I would even say this would give a more human face to Europe. So certainly the goal is desirable, to use your word, but I think it would be very difficult to implement. Even if you choose the idea of a European basic benefit, as suggested in a paper from the French Treasury. They suggest that there would be a basic benefit, 50% of the lost earnings for 12 months. But even that would require some kind of harmonization. For example, for the eligibility criteria, the number of months of employment which are required, the reference period. I think that there are also, you would have to agree, or do you give such a benefit to somebody who voluntarily quit his job? This is a type of question you will have to give an harmonized answer. I think this would be very, very difficult. And moreover, you could have, if you use this system in a way, you would ask countries which have very efficient employment agencies, which can very quickly put people again at work, they would support countries less efficient in this respect. So I'm sorry, probably I'm at the end of my time. I just would say that to fund this euro area budget, again, ideally, we would need an own resource. And this could be, for example, a small percentage on corporate profits. But this would require an harmonization of the tax base. And you know that the Commission has already done an excellent work on this, but we are still very far from an agreement. In a recent publication, Minister Gabriel and Macron suggested that this own resource could be the tax on financial transactions, but this would imply that, you know, that for the moment there are negotiations about this tax among 11 countries. You would need an agreement with 19 countries, and I'm afraid this will take more time. So probably, at least in the first stage, we should look for national contributions. For which amount? Gunther and Wolf gave an estimate. You say 1% of the Eurozone. Maybe it could be less if this budget could have a borrowing capacity. And I noticed that the Gliniker group, this group of 12 German economists, spoke about 0.5%. So I think 0.5% is something which, in my view, could be feasible. But I stop here. Sorry, I've been too long.
Not much too long. Thank you. So you're saying a number of things are desirable but hard to implement in practice, because you gave the reasons, but also you gave the difficulties.
Certainly, to use output gap would be very controversial, because there are too much changes in the estimate. Using employment insurance, again, is desirable, but I think this would require an harmonization of several concepts, and which would be very difficult given the very different tradition of social dialogue among member countries.
Thank you. I suggest we leave Daniel some time to catch up. Jakob.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the topics we're discussing today, they have something in common. I think Bruegel was a bolder project than people had imagined. The euro was a bolder project than people had imagined. And I think fiscal capacity for the euro area is also a bolder project than many of us perhaps imagine right now. And I leave it to you, sort of, where perhaps boldness paid off most handsomely. So with that opening remark, I want to explain why I think ultimately when we talk about fiscal capacity, it's the question, how bold do we want to be? Or put more dramatically, do we want to open the floodgates? And opening the floodgates would mean to give, I don't know, a Euro government and a Euro Parliament full access to the European tax base. That's ultimately what we would be talking about. My answer to that sort of line of reasoning would be no, and certainly no for quite a while. And if that's one's point of departure, then there are a couple of things that flow immediately from it. I think this idea of an aggregate stabilization of the cycle in normal times, frankly, I don't see it happening with the kind of tool we have at hand. First of all, as you know, I don't want to go into the debate of how big of a problem is it really in normal times, especially if the individual country rules are sufficiently intelligent. It's not so clear how big the aggregate deviation is from what it perhaps individually seems reasonable. There's an interesting question that I see very little discussed. What if a country is supposed to take a more aggressive fiscal stance than it wants to? There are ways of hiding deficits. I think there are also ways of hiding surpluses. It's something that surprisingly little has been discussed, but I think it's entirely possible if a country really, if it were imposed not in an aggregate sort of budget, but if it was imposed with some kind of magical formula. It's an interesting question that I would certainly like to see a paper on how to hide a surplus or less of a deficit than people had imagined. I think certainly there's one box to me was missing. It was to do with public goods. I think one good reason to have a budget in the euro area are public goods. I'm not certain whether all the public goods I would have in mind would like it to be provided very cyclically. I mean, there will be cyclical elements of the provisioning of public goods, but I think I want them to be there all the time. Again, the two are less of a contradiction if the European budget is very large, but I just want to point to that. And then, of course, there's the question when you look at this first answer aggregate. There's the question: would we want to, if we don't go sort of all the way towards lots of own resources, do we want a preset budget to be allowed to borrow? And again, I think if we in normal times say, well, it can borrow all the time, again, I think we're ultimately talking about opening the floodgates. That's, in a nutshell, why I'm a little bit perhaps more hesitant than some of the other panelists here. On counter-cyclic transfers across countries, I'm all for it, and let me jump to sort of the instrument directly. I think I want to have it outside the budget. That's why I like unemployment insurance. That's why, in principle, if we were able to make it work, I wouldn't be against an output gap-based macro transfer scheme. I have some doubts, both in technical terms, also politically. I think politically, I'm a politician now, so I'm allowed to say it. Politically, I think the unemployment insurance mechanism, especially if it's well designed, is a kind of reinsurance mechanism taking into account certain incentive problems that were outlined. I think could be rather attractive, and it wouldn't be subject to. It would be subject to a big bargain. It wouldn't be subject to individual sort of a year-on-year negotiation, and I think that would be an advantage. That brings me to the question of supplementing monetary policy in the hopefully rare cases when monetary policy is ineffective. Yes, I think that is important. It's highly relevant now. We've created FC. I have some doubts still. I think it's a good start, but I still have some doubts how effective it's going to be. And I also have some doubt about an agenda that says, well, this is basically an embryonic form of fiscal capacity, because to me it is really hopefully an exceptional event where we would want to engage in this sort of instrument. And finally serve as a backstop to financial risk sharing. Yes, of course. I think if we want to complete banking union, I think economic history tells us that the fund we've created, which takes far too long, of course, to be created, will also be far too small if we really have a problem. And coming back to the question, do we want to open the floodgates? I think that's why I'm in favor of a beefed up ESM. Even in Germany, when the IMF disperses a tranche, the Bundestag doesn't have to vote on it. So it is entirely possible to construct perhaps a changed governance for the ESM where national parliaments are in control of the money, but not to the extent that for every single tranche they have to go and vote. Which is, of course, huge. It's a political mistake to do that, and the debate should be between Athens and Brussels, not Athens and Berlin. And I think everybody, also in Berlin, starts to understand that now. Anyway, so that's why I'm perhaps more optimistic because it's a crisis mechanism, not a sort of mechanism in normal times. Why I'm more keener on the ESM than perhaps some others. Output gap, why possible? I mentioned I have some technical concerns as well. Quality majority voting, activated joint borrowing capacity. I think there may be ways in important instances to substitute that for well-functioning ESM, which for the reason I mentioned I would prefer. And then qualified majority voting, activated mandatory fiscal coordination scheme. I have some doubts, and I don't want to repeat what I said in my introduction, how viable, even though I can see the sort of theoretical merit of doing something like that, how viable it's going to be in the end. So I hope I did the trick of explaining in more or less exactly 7 minutes what I have to say.
Exactly. Right on time. Thank you. Thank you. So Daniel, your turn. Tu peux parler français d'ailleurs. Tu peux parler français.
You can speak French if you want to, you know.
It depends on.
Let me go
Which?
in English. It would be easier for everybody. Sorry, I really apologize. I was chairing a workshop on India, and believe me, what I heard, what was going on there, makes all problems relatively easy to solve. So I had to switch because I didn't quite understand the change in the timing. But that gives me a striking way of looking at the problem that we have to solve. Maybe let me just rephrase very rapidly what are the problems and trying to stick to the basics really. First, everybody has that in mind. What we've been experiencing in Euro is really a catastrophic management of the crisis. I think everybody knows that. I was making the computation recently as to where do we stand from 2008 beginning. We are at the end of 2014. We are still below the amount of GDP that we are producing. We are the only, cumulatively speaking, according to the IMF statistic, we are minus 0.8%. Below the GDP produced in 2008. So this year maybe we'll recover where we started from. So I see Jean frowning, so let me give you the statistic of the IMF. Plus 0.5 in 2008, minus 4.5 in 2009. This is Eurozone, 2 in 2010, 1.6 in 2011, minus 0.8 in 2012, minus 0.5 in 2013, 09, and if my Excel sigma things works well, that makes minus 0.8. So I'm happy that you frown because it's a surprise.
My question was, is it GDP or GDP per capita?
GDP, amount of output produced. Okay, so in the US, the corresponding number is 0.79, and in the advanced country at large, it's 0.6%. So we are behind, everybody knows what, and that's what we want to address. If another crisis of this same kind were to be repeated, what are the tools that has been missing? I think everybody has in mind there's been two crises coming together. One which be a kind of systemic crisis, and the other one which is more a macro management kind of crisis, which under more severe forms have affected Europe, but along the same line as the other countries. The systemic risk are of two kinds. The fact that we lacked a banking union was very important in the explanation of why this crisis was so widespread and so severe, in particular in Ireland and Spain. Let me pause on that. We understand that making a monetary union without a banking union was a mistake. I think it's an interesting question politically as to why is it that this mistake was made in the first place. I think it's a combination of bounded rationality. We didn't foresee in the 90s that it would be so important to have one. If it was really on the table at that moment, if the economists with the benefit of insight had said it will fail if you don't simultaneously build up a banking union, maybe the debate would have been different. I remember debates of this kind, but not as forceful as they could have been if we really foresaw what was in the pipes because of this fallacy. Obviously, there were a key lobbyist at the time against the banking union. That was the central banks who wanted to keep the management of what they saw as the last tool of power in their hands. Again, with the benefit of insight, that was ridiculous. So we've lost time. We fixed it, but only partially. We fixed it, I think, in a good way with respect to what is non-fiscal, that is supervision of the systemic banks. But the fiscal part, which is how much money you put on the pot, is still, A, very limited, B, it's an intergovernmental business, so it doesn't have the merit of a federal insurance mechanism by which you could tap whatever resources are needed in case of crisis, and that would be my bullet number one. If we had a fiscal something, authority, then we could certainly generate the resources in due time to recap any systemic bank that would fail without having to have this complex mechanism that we have now in the process. At least it would work as a backstop. The second thing, it's more macro management, is the fact, we get back to our basics. When we discussed with Jean and others and Philippe what was going on with this monetary union, I think with Charles Viplos in particular, we produced this concept that the monetary union was good, except for one kind of shock, which was the asymmetric transitory shock. Asymmetric, because if they are symmetric, then the central bank will take care of it, and temporary, because if it's permanent anyway, you have to adjust. So you don't need, unless you go into a sort of mesogiorno kind of scheme, the country will have to adjust. But the transitory one, or long-lasting, as it was recasted afterwards, are the one for which you need fiscal instrument. And in our Mundell-Fleming way of looking at things in the time, that was perfect, because fiscal policy, the national fiscal policy could do the job by accompanying asymmetric shock, and that was the degree of freedom that they had to rely upon, and the monetary policy will be in charge of the overall management of the macro aggregates. Of course, we also said, I think at the time, that the 3% rule was born to be pro-cyclical, not counter-cyclical, because everybody understood at the time that everybody would stick to the limit, although there was warning at the time as, don't do that, go at zero to keep some degree of freedom, but the treaties being the treaty and the government being the government, in the end, yes, it became a pro-cyclical tool, and then it failed. That's something that we need to fix today. So it is fixed in a certain degree by the fact that now it's a structural deficit which has to be targeted. So we have to understand what a structural deficit means, but it's in the treaty. So you need to understand, what it means and to agree on one and play with the game of that. But if we want to go beyond, want to see what kind of change would be needed at the level of Europe, I think, and this is a discussion on unemployment benefit and these kind of things, I think, yes, there is a number of options if we had the ability to play the fiscal game at the European level. There are a number of things that could create some counter-cyclicality. Let me start by the simplest. The simplest would be that there are a certain number, unemployment benefit being one of them, but I don't care at this stage. There are a number of goods which are supplied by the Europeans, as of today, but we could change the division of task by adding a few at the European level and subtracting the equivalent numbers at the national level, such as a part of the unemployment benefits. But what is very important is that if these government expenditures are produced at the European level, the tax receipt upon which they are produced would simply need to be based not on an amount of money that you have to grant to the European level, as it is the case today, but simply a fraction of a tax base, 1% of VAT, or whatever you want, which could be corporate taxes if it was feasible and easy to monitor, and the sheer volatility of the receipt would in itself create a buffer. It could be very interesting. Ideally, a share of corporate profit, X% of corporate profit, which is the most volatile part of the tax receipt of any government, and in front of that, just a list of expenditures which are granted at the European level. Only this would deliver part of the counter-cyclicality that we want, and we all know, back from this discussion, that this is mostly the way the Americans work. That is, it's very counter-cyclical, but simply by the fact that the tax base is itself endogenous to the cycles, when many of the benefits which are granted are federal-wide and do not depend on the particular stage of the cycle where any of the states stand. So that would be, you know, something which would be big politically speaking. How much do you have? 1 minute?
Well,
it's over.
-1.
-1, okay, so that's it. And in just with 1+ minute, and because Jacob is here, in the list of things which you would put in there are taxes and expenditure, in the list of the expenditure that I would want to mutualize, simply for the sheer effect of having a counter-cyclicality dimension attached to the process, I would take a part of servicing the debt. I like the blue-red story. If we could go beyond unemployment benefits, see that it's a broader problem. If you had 60% of the debt, which is European-wide and serviced by European taxes, so you don't add to government expenditures, you simply mutualize the financing of part of these expenditures, and you would go very cheaply to your blue-red stuff. So as far as the macroeconomist is concerned, the way to go is relatively straightforward if we want to address this dimension of banking union, the systemic risk, the blue-red systemic risk, the sheer counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy. It's just a matter of paying for the same thing, but in a different way. But of course, you need all the business of making this possible at the political level. But if you could reassure the people that it will not cost more for the citizen, it's just a matter of changing the way they pay it along the cycle, that could be, I mean, the contribution of the economists to this discussion. Sorry, yeah, that's...
Bon, merci Daniel. Merci à tous.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for answering the questions. Let me say something about those questions now.
Oui, c'est ça le pouvoir.
When you ask questions, you don't always have to explain why you ask them, not till afterwards. But basically, you answered pretty much in the same way. You focused on the stabilizing effect of the budget, of fiscal measures. But the reason I asked the questions this way was that if you take the Maastricht system as starting point, there's a very clear vision of stabilization, which is a stabilization for symmetric shocks, as monetary union. The fiscal policy is to be used at national level. And you have various cycles, cyclical, this could be break-even too. So what has not worked is the fact that we underestimated the financial dimension, and therefore underestimated the need for a fiscal backstop for the financial system. All that was very much underestimated. Secondly, we underestimated the fact that monetary policy could be completely impotent or partially so. So you might need an aggregated fiscal policy if monetary policy couldn't really play its role because of very deep recession, possibility of depression. And that raises another question. namely over and above national roles of fiscal policy for asymmetric shocks. Should we have a collective policy? And this was the question in 2008-2009. I also underestimated the limits of policies for stabilization being reached quicker than expected. And this was true even of states that seemed to be in a sound position, Ireland, for example, and Spain. And there we found that we reached the limits of borrowing quicker than expected. Going forward, we can expect states to be very cautious in face of the next recession because they wonder when they hit the bottom. So they're perhaps under-provisioned stabilization. And the political dimension was underestimated, the fact that in very tense situations, and I think somebody, Reza, who was stressing this, we need transfers for political reasons in order to maintain acceptance of the adjustment imposed by EMU in particularly difficult situations. Now, I think you would agree that you've answered this partially, because here I don't see how we respond to the possible need to use fiscal policy as macroeconomic instrument at the aggregated level, bearing in mind that a common instrument will always be small compared with national budgets. And so, well, for political reasons, there will be transfers, international transfers that can play a political role, which could help stabilization. But macroeconomically, basically, the question is, what are the national fiscal policies? And there was an answer to that. We're looking at something that it seems to me is quantitatively secondary. Yes, but whether it's pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical, same thing as the United States. Is that what you're saying? That's what we saw in the 90s. No. But you were talking about using high elastic expenditure or income. Yeah. I think it's possible to have certain influence there. Well, Dana says it works both ways. Yes, but what happens at the same time to national fiscal policies? Are they going to be neutral or fiscal policy if they're pro-cyclical at the same time? And there's not much point. It seems to me that today's question, because there's also a question of national fiscal policy incentivizing pro-cyclicity, but there's an elephant in the room. Guntram, and then we'll open it up to general discussion.
I just want to add on a couple of points. I mean, the first point is something that I think Jakob also quickly mentioned. It's the question of public good, and I think that's something that very often just slips away. But you know, basically, fiscal policy is not just about stabilization. It's about providing public goods. And so far here, we've been discussing only the stabilization role, but we haven't been discussing what are the relevant public goods that we actually want to have in the EU that are sensible public goods for the EU as a whole and or for the euro area. And so it seems to me that perhaps one way of pushing the debate where you know, you can perhaps also move a bit the hard lines in the debate is perhaps on this, because with public goods you create something, you know, that provides a positive vision to everybody. Ideally, that's the nature of public goods. So I would encourage us to think a little bit about this. And I mean, just two words on this. You have defense, of course, which is an issue one could discuss, and you have also all the issues of energy infrastructure, energy security, and so on. Now, the second point I wanted to make is on the whole stabilization question more specifically. And there, it seems to me that Jean makes a very good point in the sense that the bulk of spending is national. So if you get national spending constrained and massively constrained, it's very difficult to find kind of an outside mechanism that would compensate for that, because ultimately the bulk of spending, social security, pension, the public sector, all of this is national. And so it seems to me that I would put much more emphasis, and my own thinking has actually shifted on this. I would put much more emphasis on the coordination of national policies, so that the sum of the national policies actually add up to sensible fiscal stance for the euro area as a whole. And I would put a lot of emphasis on the fact that every country should ideally continue to have market access. Now, to have market access, what do we need? Well, we have the ESM as a backstop that ensures kind of is insurance to market access. We have OMT that has been tremendously important to actually ensure that countries have market access. Without OMT, Italy wouldn't have market access currently, and so would have much more restrictive fiscal policy. But perhaps those two instruments are insufficient to guarantee the market access we need in order to really achieve the national fiscal stabilization. Perhaps finally, on the zero lower bound, I would also there, I guess, concur with Jean. I mean, we have circumstances where we have a zero lower bound, and quite frankly, if we look at the current situation, while I'm supportive of the QE program and so on, I mean, I think as an economist, we would wish to see a little bit more action on the fiscal side and a little bit less action by the monetary policy authorities. And at the moment, we just don't have that. So I think at the zero lower bound, when monetary policy becomes less effective, we would like to have a mechanism to activate this national fiscal policy much more strongly. And for this, I think ultimately we need a coordination mechanism that involves all countries, so not just the weak countries, but also the stronger countries, and put some burden on the stronger countries for the stabilization as such.
Let me open the floor. I will give the panelists another opportunity, obviously, to speak, but perhaps there are pressing questions here. Yeah, Pierre, Natacha, and Benoît.
Et je vais parler français.
A couple of things I want to say here. The list of the three names that Reza gave, I think there are two missing from that. The first, which is in the treaty, the no's, sorry, to banking supervision. I can tell you, having been in French banking, that national central banks did not want to even consider that for employment reasons also, but because they were also worried about conflict of interest between ECB's monetary policy and its supervision. We spent more time on those no's than on monetary policy. It might seem surprising, it was in 91. Then there was a no to the IMF. And here I question, really. And Jean-Claude Trichet was thinking along those lines just before the crisis as well. No, he says, I wrote the exact opposite. Okay, today, in 2015, it's a good thing to have the IMF involved in this. And another question, in your view as to what's desirable, difficult, possible, or whatever, I didn't hear anything about a political acceptability of economic policies. People don't understand it. I mean, 3%, 5%, whatever, people don't understand. And how do we best get people to understand?
Two questions of two different orders. The first one would be on the institutional, concrete institutional solutions we would have for the sort of fiscal capacity concept we've been discussing, and in particular the role of the ESM in that thinking. And I would like to relate to what Philippe said and also to what Jakob said in terms of the role of the ESM. I think you mentioned something more of a narrow interpretation of what the ESM should be doing, and if I interpret it well, you say the ESM has in the text the capacity to do a direct recapitalization of the banking system. We should first see that in action and perhaps move to a more ambitious plan. And I understand that your view on the role of the ESM would be more related to something like having a fiscal agent or something with an issuance capacity on behalf of some kind of federal or quasi-federal entity. So I would like to hear you more, develop more about how the ESM as such can be used, because to me it's a very pragmatic sort of short-term solution that could be on the table. And in particular, what do you think about the current governance of ESM, the fact that the shareholders of the ESM are, you know, member states? So how do you square this with a more federal sort of dimension of its role? How changes would be possible without having to go through treaty changes. So it's a very pragmatic question for very short-term thinking. And the second one relates to what has just been said in terms of the economy politique of the whole thing. And I think here Reza, Philippe, and Guntram said things that have something in common: the human face of Europe, the need of transfers for political reasons, and you know, also the fact that the people, the citizens, don't really get it anymore, what the positive aspect of EMU and EU is. So as an alternative to money transfers, couldn't we think about, on the basis of a given budget, it being 0.5 or 1% of GDP or whatever, think about, instead of transferring money as non-employment insurance, we could transfer you know, allowances to alleviate poverty, for example, paying the electricity bills of households or caring for poverty alleviation, you know, programs that would be, you know, easy to evaluate, the criteria would be easy to harmonize, and it would be extremely visible to, you know, simple people, not only those speaking in this room, but people in the street. So that would be my second question.
Benoît Mejean. Parle un peu plus sur le micro.
Two remarks. First, in terms of what took us where we are in terms of the crisis, you mentioned that we underestimated the financial instability dimension of this crisis. And in a way, the euro has been a financial innovation which market participants took time to understand. And we are in this process. I mean, this crisis has been a process of learning how to manage with this new dimension of this new currency and what it implies in several member states. But the financial instability dimension has been central, and in this respect, a lot of progress have been made. We have a banking union, we have macroprudential policies which conceptually did not exist before this crisis, and basically the new child that arrived after this crisis. And to some extent, I wonder whether you're not trying to overwhelm fiscal policy with respect to the need of stabilization going into the future. Given the new institutions we have with respect to managing financial instability, the least we could hope is that we will not go through the same magnitude of capital flows that were as destabilizing as they were. Just to recall, the growth rate of credit to the private sector in Greece was of the order of 20% per annum before the crisis. In Spain, has been of the order of 10 to 15% per annum before the crisis. This is
comes from.
How to improve fiscal policy at the European level. Going back to what Jean-Claude Trichet said, that we need democratic accountability, do you think we are in a situation now, comparing to what was made in the 80s and early 90s, we are in a political situation now where we need to go through very prudently by small steps, or we still in a situation where we could make a very bold breakthrough in terms of putting more basically insurance to common fiscal policy institutions in the euro area?
Thank you for raising this point. I think it's very important that we discuss it, the financial risk sharing and the substitutability between financial risk sharing and fiscal policy. Perhaps also what we would need to have financial risk sharing to a degree that would really make it possible to think in terms of substitution. I give the floor to Pervenche and then back to the panel. Let me already mention that ceux qui sont dans la deuxième salle peuvent aussi poser des questions.
You can, of course, ask questions if you're sitting at the back of the room. There's a microphone there too. Okay, thank you. This question of fiscal capacity is something that's been discussed in different ways for a long time now. And I can't remember what term was used by Werner in his report when he said it should be 5% of GDP. But maybe they weren't quite as bold as Bruegel at the time, but it was the sort of level that he'd identified at a time when a lot of the issues we have today weren't even visible. I'm not sure if the 5% figure would be kept today, but it's worth remembering it when we talk about this now. And when the European Parliament, this question of fiscal capacity was addressed with Jacob, because a couple of days ago the Economic and Monetary Committee report was adopted on that. And the debate is about three functions that Jean has identified in his questions, but which perhaps call for different answers. Three functions: supporting structural reform, maintaining a sufficient level of investment in order to have an aggregated fiscal capacity for the zone, and the ability to resist asymmetric shocks. So going to what Daniel says, that there was first function that was there from the beginning, but since there was no convergence after we introduced the euro, there's this new dimension that came through and requires us to think about the question of fiscal capacity in a different manner. If today, I mean, on the basis of what the Commission said about the euro in 2008, the big issue to look at is not asymmetric shock, it's convergence. And here, the first answer, everyone agreed on saying that we needed a Eurozone budget. That seems to me the right answer. The rest will come along naturally as contributions, minimum, unemployment benefit, etc. I understand that people have said this is complicated, yes, but at the same time, there's banking union, which was just as complicated, and the guarantee deposit that nobody wants today. What you're saying is that we should harmonize the basic conditions, make intervention possible. No. This, of course, brings in the social partners and collective bargaining agreements and all the rest. There's an advantage to this, which is giving the signal that the Economic and Monetary Union also is about social conditions applicable to people. That is, we're coming back to what Natasha said. I thought that, for example, when we set up the young person's guaranteed income, this was something that we should have done, not the way it was done, but based on a real budget for the Eurozone, which would mean that people get the impression that the Eurozone is interested in them and takes care of them. And in answer to Jean's question, the right answer, I think, I mean, not the aggregation of the three mechanisms that you mentioned, fiscal capacity in the Eurozone, and then a minimum employment benefit, and then the ESM. But I don't think we should be too exclusive about this. And basically what I would say to the panelists is, if you all agree that we need a Eurozone fiscal capacity, how can we do it without reforming treaties? And how can we do it, and what do we do until we reform the treaties? Philip Mechtat, because I see he's asked for the floor, and then others. Okay, well, Pervenche Mérez asked me directly about this question of a common unemployment insurance system. I said from the outset I think it would be an excellent thing if we could have that, because it would directly relate to people. And the issue is, as has been said, people feel disconnected. They don't understand what's going on. But I don't think that we could set up that kind of system without a certain level of harmonization when it comes to eligibility criteria. And there are huge differences between countries there. The vesting period, for example, you have to have worked for a certain number of years. I don't want to go into the details, but just looking at that, we can see there are vast differences between unemployment benefit systems in different countries. Well, I don't know about that. Yes, but if you want to harmonize everything, fair enough. But if we define a minimum benefit of 2 or 3 months, yes, but even for that, you have to decide who's eligible, because there'll be people who are saying, yes, we have to pay up for unemployed in a country that has a very broad definition of the unemployed. Would we all agree that in Belgium you're entitled to benefits even if you never worked? Countries that impose strict eligibility conditions are not going to like it. So if we do that, we need a minimum level of harmonization. This is why I say, you know, as a first stage is that I would like us to move towards that sort of system. But the first stage, because this relates to people, a country that has suffered an asymmetric shock, leading to much sharper increase in unemployment in that country than in the average Eurozone, then there would be intervention to help that country pay for the additional unemployment benefits. So you could say 70% of the additional expenditure would be covered by this Eurozone budget. 30% is still left up to the country. The advantage is that you don't need to harmonize everything from the outset. You can implement this on the basis of national systems, which are different, but you send out a strong signal, because the government that receives that European budget support will find it very hard to do away with its unemployment benefit scheme. It will have to keep it, which is an interesting form, a good form of stabilization during recession, because they're low-income individuals, and if you support them, an IMF report last week showed that it has much more impact on growth. So I'm saying, first stage, you can give visibility Eurozone budget by intervening, by paying some of the extra costs without having harmonization, because that will take a much longer time to achieve it.
Maybe 2 areas I would answer. First of all, this the issue of political acceptability. I think it is interesting to note that the crisis response over the last 5 years, it has increased integration and it has increased solidarity. We see increased integration in things like the banking union, increased solidarity through providing financing through ESM. But we have to recognize that, so Europe has become more integrated and it has shown the ability to help each other. But that has also has had two observations of that. One, it has been done under duress. It's easier to do that when the essence of the union is at stake. And in 2012, Provence is absolutely right. Banking union was very complicated, but it went through all the political hoops, including the European Parliament, very quickly, much quicker than I would have expected. I remember the first time this was discussed in Eurogroup in June 2012. By the end of 2012, it was done. I mean, it is record speed for Europe. But it was also because there was huge financial pressure in terms of access to the markets, for instance, and the monetary policy was not being effective. So now that stress is probably not there, but also the integration has some, and the solidarity has also put the politics under constraint. And so the expectation that one could do more, particularly on the fiscal front, which is very difficult, I think one has to be realistic. And so this is why I was advocating that one needs to, while continue to push this and continue to work in terms of how, what are the ideal solutions, but I think in terms of coming back to financial stability and political viability, one can focus on critical areas which are needed, which are in essence fiscal solidarity, like bank recapitalization. Now, unfortunately, the ESM bank recapitalization, it has been designed in a way that cannot really be used. It requires that the government put in the entire negative net worth. It would require government guarantees. It does not sever the link between the sovereign and the bank. The same thing about the backstop that is currently there. Everybody recognizes it is too small, even when it has been fully put in place. Counter-cyclical measures we discussed. I think the political difficulties that Philippe has mentioned are paramount, but I think given the social stress that one sees in Europe, I think it is possible to argue that. And finally, I would say investment. I think that is, again, an area where I think there would be political acceptability to go across borders, and there will be issues to go across borders. Point number two, on fiscal framework. Even those who understand the fiscal framework extremely well, and there are many in this room, I challenge them to describe it to the layman in Europe. It is not possible to explain why the same target for the same country and then different countries meeting them at different period of time when they exceed it, sometimes depending on their size, and why you need for the same countries, whether the debt is 10%, close to 10% like in Luxembourg, or 170% in Greece, they need to have the same long-term structural balance target. It does not make sense. So, and it does not make sense, and because of that, it will not be met. I showed you it has never been met. It will not be met going forward, and it undermines credibility. So the thing is to move to something which makes more sense, can explain it better, and I think that also generates public support and generates support for greater integration. Thank you.
Just a few comments. I think following up on also what both Philippe and Pervenche said, I think there are really a 2-by-2 sort of matrix, and we need to be clear as to which box we want to fill. One is full convergence. Let's go. Everyone in Europe should, in the long run, have the same level of income per head. And contra-cyclical measure, which is that they deserve the same umbrella, the same insurance against adverse shock. Honestly, politically, economically, the priority is the insurance umbrella. In the very long run, all citizens of Europe will have, by the sheer force of what we've been observing in Spain and Portugal and so on, will have the same income per head. For the people, I don't think this is a priority. The priority, of course, they want to be richer. The priority is to make sure that they don't go from 10 to 25% unemployment rate it's a matter of a few months, simply because of the fact that the rule and so on of Europe makes it impossible in their eyes to respond to the crisis. So insurance versus convergence, I would vote for insurance as a priority, as a political priority. That's my, perhaps, element of disagreement. And in response to Guntram also, insurance to me is a public good. I mean, as important as equal access to whatever, public goods that you may have in mind. Providing stability is a sort of public good that can only be provided with the law of large numbers by a large number of people. So that's critical. So insurance, convergence, insurance comes one. Second part of the matrix, rules or discretion. Ability of a government of Europe to respond by doing this or that, or rule-based mechanism. We are all shy because we know that discretion is very difficult. So I think in the way we discuss about the problem, and rightly so, given the implicit political constraint that we internalize, a rule-based mechanism is good. So if you put that together, insurance, priority, rule-based priority, we must converge on what it can be. So I don't really care as to whether it's a full harmonization of the unemployment benefit or simply a sort of rule-based mechanism by which you source the financing of a country's problem when dealing with unemployment by a rule-based transfer due to this or that. I think this is at any cost the way to work through. And even if only one part was, this is getting back to what I was saying, if only one part of the equation was solved, namely the expenditures themselves may not be the most pro or contra-cyclical, but at least the resource-based upon which they are funded are themselves, by their sheer definition, contra-cyclical, I think it will already be a progress. So let me just elaborate a little bit on the my blue-red way of reinterpreting this idea in terms of this debate. If you say the first X billion of euro corresponding of the interest paid on the first 60% of GDP, and obviously it would be a negative transfer for those who are behind, but that's, who cares, are covered by European-wide tax. It's so easy to think of. You take 1% of VAT, this is dedicated to paying the first 60% of the debt. And it is designed and perhaps changed over the years so as to meet exactly the interest bill on this first 60%, which would be European-wide. We would have made, with a very simple formula, a huge progress. We would have created a safe asset at the level of Europe. We would have created exactly the mechanism that we want. And it would not fit all the dimensions that we want, because it would be the first 60% when a perfect insurance mechanism would be the last 60%. But all right, let's go with that because we know that it's incentive compatible. And with the benefit of having a low debt by the fact that you receive a transfer in proportion exactly to the economy. So I think if we are reasonable enough to rule-based and thinking of the insurance that we can provide, the political obstacle may be less than the one that we may fear at this moment.
Yeah, I'll try to be perhaps on Natasha's question. Ultimately, what I'm arguing is that there is a possible division of labor between national governments and national parliaments who would not hand over their responsibility, their full responsibility to have access to the tax base that is far more intelligent than the present one, and that would go a very long way towards meeting the kind of goals that we've been discussing. And that's in essence what I'm saying, and that's in essence also what we try to elaborate a little bit on in the Glienicke paper. And you know whether it's 0.5% or 1%, but that's the essence of it, and that of course also applies to the ESM. And I've mentioned one, I think, functional deficiency, which has nothing to do with, I don't know, the German constitution, and has all to do with what at the time seemed to be clever politics, and now we realize it's not very clever. Now, of course, this requires to have a proper proper euro area government of sort, and a proper euro area parliament of sort. And Pervenche, you raised the question of treaty change and what is possible without treaty change. And since there recently was a joint paper between Germany, elaborated between Germany and France, and I think there was very much joint responsibility for the lack of ambition in that paper. I think I can permit myself to say I'm very worried about it. I'm very worried about it because I think for as long as we don't have the kind of institutions on the euro side that we would require, it's going to be very hard to fix some of the problems we've been talking about, irrespective of the different variants, and there are lots of very interesting variants. I think it's a dangerous strategy to simply say, well, let's stop any serious reflection until, I don't know, after 2017, and I'm much looking forward to hopefully what I understand is a slightly more ambitious 5 presidents report. So let's see, but I think it's important mentioning that, and I'm aware of all the political difficulties. Perhaps in closing, on insurance. I think one of the difficulties is in the private sector there are lots of people very good at sort of running around selling insurance to people, and perhaps sometimes people buy the kind of insurance they don't need. I think in the European context, insurance may be an uphill struggle. And certainly insurance for rare events is a particularly difficult thing to do. So I think in terms of political sustainability, I tend to be rather keen on tangible public goods to be part of the equations, and tangible public goods that deliver a real value added even in normal times. And I think while this is not a purely economical argument, I think it's something we ought to bear in mind. That is not excluding sort of more purebred insurance type arrangements like unemployment insurance or other schemes, but I think in essence to hope that we would have a politically stable setup without something that delivers a clear benefit in normal times, I don't think that's a realistic proposition, but perhaps historians rather than economists should look at that.
Okay.
Any other urgent questions? Otherwise, we have to move to the next roundtable. But if someone has a burning question, they can ask it now. If we look at developing countries, all these issues are relevant too, and the emerging solution is the combination of a stabilization fund with the fiscal rules that works in Chile, for example. How you initiate that stabilization fund? Well, it could be taking some of the risk of the central bank to start with, plus general taxation in the countries where this happens. Usually it's on raw materials. And the question of expenditure, well, that can be left up to states to decide. It is a funding provided by the Stabilization Fund that gives some leeway, and it's reimbursable, refundable when things go well. It seems a bit more complicated in Europe. Could we consider taxing energy consumption, for example? We have a sort of excise duty on energy to build up the fund without talking about what will be done with that, but it will be autonomous government based on criteria. Do you think that's something that could work? Anyone feel they can field that question? Well, the question's a bit different here, isn't it? Because stabilization fund we're talking about here for Chile is for instability due to volatility of export prices. So you need to set aside and then smooth out the income from the profits of that resource so as to avoid macroeconomic instability. It's about absorbing volatility. So these are rules that apply to how you can draw on that resource. You talked about cyclicity, but it's single source cyclicity, raw material price volatility. This is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is how, I mean, this is what national fiscal policies do. The question is, should we do it through national budgets, or should there be some sort of European budget? Should it be done national budgets or financial stabilization that some people have said, taking the view that it's about financial risk sharing, that we'll have stabilization, or should we have a percentage-based system? Or should we be using surpluses and deficits? Yes. Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there, hoping to have shed some light on the question. Not sure we really have. It's not easy to illuminate, but we now move on to the second part of our event. So those who are not on the panel might want to move to a seat further from the table.
Let's move to the second panel. Our second panel is about structural convergence. Does a monetary union actually need structural convergence to work? And if it does, how can it actually be achieved? Now, as you know, the crisis discussion has really focused on, I would say, three major areas. The first is finance. Financial system trouble, banking trouble. The second is fiscal policy, and we just had a big discussion on fiscal policy. And the third discussion is of course about structural policies. It is about competitiveness. It is about divergence in unit labor costs. It is about low productivity growth that imposes externalities on other countries. It is about high private and public sector debt and how to deal with that debt level. It is about perhaps also low inflation and to what extent low inflation prevents adjustment between countries in a monetary union. And perhaps even to mention one other structural issue about the structure of the financial system and to what extent the financial system can actually absorb risks. So I would say the whole discussion on the, let's say, the structural, perhaps more long-term issues often comes up in the discussion on monetary union, but it is often also not very concrete. So people ask countries, Greece to do structural reforms, they ask Italy to do structural reforms, but perhaps they are not as specific, at least not in the public discourse, than one would like to see. So I think as a starting point, we have here an excellent panel to discuss these issues, to discuss the issue of unit labor cost divergence. And I think since Jean-Claude Trichet started this conference, les courbes de Trichet, so the curves that show the unit labor cost divergence in the monetary union, and that has happened very, very strongly in the first 10 years of monetary union, is a topic that, to my mind, is still on the table. I mean, we have had divergences in unit labor costs between, let's say, a country like Italy and Germany of 20–30%. And if you see at the correction that has happened, we see very little correction, neither in Germany nor in Italy. Now, the correction we do see is in some smaller member states, and mostly in member states under program, under severe financial distress. But we do not see really a significant readjustment in the unit labor costs between the major countries of monetary union, so basically the big 3–4 countries in EMU. So the question is, how do we deal with this now? What kind of mechanisms do we need to deal with this in the future? Do we need some form of competitiveness councils that at least monitor this, which is a suggestion that André Sapir, my colleague André Sapir, so the Belgian André Sapir, and myself have recently made in a paper, and that was actually picked up by Jerome Dijsselbloem in his letter to the candidacy of the Eurogroup. So should we think about some mechanisms to monitor competitiveness divergences, unit labor cost divergences, and if necessary to actually act on these divergences by issuing guidelines in the wage setting process? In Belgium, such a mechanism exists. So we have a Conseil de compétitivité, I think it's called in Belgium, that looks at unit labor cost developments of Belgium relative to its major trading partners, so basically to the Netherlands, France, and Germany. And whenever there is a divergence that becomes quite persistent, this council issues so-called norms, wage norms that are not directly binding, but that guide the wage setting process. Now, one can say, well, why do we need all of this? Well, I would say because we are still far away from a true monetary union which is fully federal, where there's lots of labor market mobility that would actually otherwise ensure that these kind of divergences don't become too persistent and don't become too harmful. So I think there is a case that one can make, and I know that this is a discussion that is currently ongoing. Let me mention productivity growth. When we look at productivity performance, we see that the productivity growth over the long period of monetary union, so the 15–16 years, has been very different in the different countries. The most worrying, one of the most worrying one is Italy, where basically productivity growth has been zero over the last 20 years. And there is the question, what does this mean? What does it mean if a major country in the monetary union does not grow and therefore potentially will end up with a number of significant problems, including debt sustainability that could be put into question? So I think there are huge questions that arise here, yet the agenda is perhaps very country-specific, but there's a coordination issue also. And so I want to discuss this today with our three excellent panelists. And what we decided is to be very democratic and follow the alphabetic order. And so without much further ado, Elie, I give the floor to you.
Bien, je veux bien commencer, et comme on a la faculté de parler en français.
Right, I'll start. Apparently I can speak French, although it said on the program it was in English, but I'll take this opportunity to speak French. The question is, should we support convergence policies in order to consolidate EMU? Well, it was discussed at length by economists, and in some previous life in the EEC, we discussed this. There was a report by Charles Briefclos that reached two conclusions. The first was that, economically speaking, you can't really see any convincing argument to implement convergence policies with respect to structuring supply structure on the labor market for products and services, because it was considered it was up to each country based on its own internal malfunctions to implement reform and enjoy the advantage of that with respect to its own competitiveness and its role in a broader production system. Apart from the economic policy argument, if we leave it up to each country, be perfectly free to organize their own reforms on the labor market and products and services, there could be internal lobbies, capture of influence, whereby the sum of individual solutions and national compromises might not produce the optimum overall solution. And for that reason, that reason alone, and given that it has been seen that you can have this sort of lobbying effect, it could be worthwhile to work towards convergence and deliberately implement convergence policies. Now, I think that debate at the time is one that's a bit outdated now, because, if I can put it that way, we have had the crisis, which enables us to look back, and it's taught us some lessons, and not just the recession, but several decades of community work. And what the two together have shown us is that far from there being a process of convergence, there's been growing divergence over time. Firstly, as has been said, in the structure of the real economy, polarization, for example, which is explainable with the theory of agglomeration. But there have been a specialization of national production systems which went further than what were expected. And those who thought that European integration would produce a sort of production jigsaw that was ideal, they now have to realize that polarization has led to an acceleration of deindustrialization in countries that are already in that process, and acceleration of industrial specialization in countries that were already specializing. And that has an immediate effect on current balances and the ability of some countries to fund their imports with their exports. And so in a system, a European system characterized by a single market and currency, once you have countries that have a structural deficit in their current balance and others that have structural surpluses, you've got a problem that cannot be overlooked. And this lesson from history in terms of specialization, what the recessions have shown, is that we cannot ignore that. Second thing, as Guntram was saying just now, there are other forms of divergence. Over time, some countries have maintained a virtuous cycle between productivity gains and labor salary gains, and there are others that are always in a situation of imbalance with those two factors. We know there's Denmark, there's France, and it's also true of Greece. Now, once you have this systematic divergence, that leads to problems too when it comes to the EMU. Another divergence that we've been able to observe is in terms of pace of reform. What Viplo said about the need for a national strategy for buying into reforms, national ownership, is very important when it comes to reforms, except that some countries went much further in their structural reforms on market for goods and services, labor and capital, and also when it comes to tax policies as well, which enhance competitiveness or not. They went at different speeds, and so systematically you have imbalance. And I won't go into the last divergence too much, which is with respect to the culture of stability, financial stability, and public spending and income. So if we take that situation of divergence as revealed by the recession and crisis, which means that you have balance of payments problems in the Eurozone and problems of financing in that same zone, we need to reconsider what we mean by convergence. Now, our friends in Bruegel published a very bold paper on that, because basically they're saying that we need mechanisms that would involve public finance or national committees capped by a body at European level, and the same thing for competitiveness, that those bodies could decide to overrule decisions taken in national budget setting or competitiveness policies. Now, this procedure is highly innovative and quite a shock, because when you think of what public opinion is like around Europe, when no one now dares say that they're in favor of further integration or even keeping current level of information, the idea of giving these huge powers to a European body, it means that you're out of touch with reality. But when you think about it more, you have to say, well, if Bruegel did it, there must be a reason. No smoke without fire. And thinking a bit more, you say, and actually they hint at this, that in conditions of exception, when a country gradually loses control of its public finance policies, when competitiveness divergences are too great, if you want to avoid corrective action that will be even more painful, then this proposal is a form of prevention, which would mean that you would nip the problem in the bud. And when there are exceptional circumstances, you would take decisions that would then have to be justified through national and democratic legitimacy. Now, if you see it in that light, it seems to be more favorable. But that means you have to be clear about what you mean by this sort of proposal. What terms are we talking about? Well, it means that, first of all, you'd have to agree on targets. Firstly, for competitiveness, so what is the benchmark? What's the direction you want to go in? What would be the timing to get there? There would have to be that agreement on what's desirable. After that, you could imagine that there would be national programs and ownership of said programs. And for ownership, this mechanism based on local and European committees will give you a dialectic, which would mean that you'd gradually be able to reach these common positions. Then you'd have to have democratic legitimacy, as I explained. In that respect, there are a lot of ideas flying around at the moment about whether you shouldn't have a second chamber, etc. Personally speaking, I think we're looking at this from the wrong angle. The only really permanent factor is national democratic legitimacy. It has to be done at national level, and that is part and parcel of the convergence and consolidation strategy. So if we can agree on this, where would the problem lie? It would be, I think, that you'd have to pick areas where you would try to move forward, and you would have to deal with those countries that have a huge gap compared with the route to set. I'm very struck by the events in Greece at the moment, and everyone went back to revisit the fundamentals of Greece, which hadn't been done before. And in doing so, what have we found? It's that even in a country that's lost 27% of GDP, salaries have plummeted, and public spending the same, they cannot bounce back using this competitive edge and improve their national economy. The problem is that they don't have a productive system that is part of either Europe or the world, and therefore even a favorable competitive shock of this dimension doesn't provide for the bounce back. And so what you find is there's a country that's massively under-industrialized. I think industry is 4% of Greek GDP. Most of its current balance items are in a deficit, apart from tourism, oil products, and shipping. I mean, Greece doesn't produce any oil, of course, but it does some processing, refining. Tourism is a real business, and shipping doesn't have a domestic impact. So there's one. I know I've gone over my time, but the problem is with the production system. So if we want to imagine a sustainable convergence phenomena, you have, in some cases, problem of failed states. You have to rethink how the economy should be structured if you want to converge and stay in the European Union. And also, when it comes to structural reforms where you need convergence mechanism, I think it's not just important to set targets and timelines, but also support mechanisms to fund and support transitions. I don't have time to go into this, but I think we would need tax reform, but it's quite clear to me that a transition from the current tax system to what would be desirable has a cost. And it's not just how to negotiate such a transition. That process would have to be financially supported. So in a nutshell, we should support convergence, definitely, but that cannot just involve setting targets, taking decisions, and pushing things through. There, I would agree with you that we need slightly more coercive mechanisms, but the coercion has to be offset with support and negotiation of the transition to the desirable state. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation. Before turning to Philippe, let me just ask you perhaps one short follow-up question, because you mentioned this very important point that a country like Greece has basically no industry and has suffered also from an ongoing deindustrialization. So if you really want to address this, I mean, what kind of tools do we actually have? I mean, do we actually have a case? Do you know of a good example where outside help, where structural funds or anything of that sort have actually led to reindustrialization, I mean, successfully?
Je crois qu'il y a deux points. Il y a d'une part la...
Well, there are 2 points. There's the suggestion you make with another think tank, which says that we should favor industrial activities development by setting up tax-free zones, financing a development without constraint. We know that Greece has difficulty developing activities, and at the same level, the legal system, the admin system are very heavy. It's a weight, it's a burden. So mechanism that would develop tax-free industrial areas would be a good idea, but even more simple. I often go to Greece, like you, and I'm struck by the paralysis that is not touching the productive system. SMEs that cannot finance themselves, etc. And I think that the 3 or 4 provisions that worked in the Small Business Act, access to innovation, access to market, all these mechanisms of Small Business Act that could finance, that could provide help from the outside, is maybe one factor to improve the situation in Greece. Just guarantee sources of financing that are not under threat, guarantee for payment of public orders. This stop and go in terms of paying the suppliers, hospitals in Greece today, this stop and go is completely destroying the productive system, the production system in Greece.
Some preliminary remarks on what I mean by structural convergence, if I want to answer your question. So in some sense, I think it's very close to what Elie was saying. It's convergence in terms of long-term TFP, GDP per capita, and in some sense related to what Philippe Maystadt was saying also in terms of the structure maybe of labor markets or the efficiency of labor markets, because this is linked to the difficulty maybe to put into place some insurance mechanisms. Also on for example, and competitiveness and unit labor cost, and just to show that this is a quite difficult issue and related to more short-term issues, and it's difficult to distinguish them, is that clearly, for example, if you look at Spain and Ireland during the 2000s, their increase in unit labor cost was very much linked to the financial bubble. And so clearly, from that point of view, structural convergence is certainly linked to macroprudential policies and short-term macro policies. Now, so let me try to answer your question. So, and in some sense, it relates to what you said, Elie. On purely economic grounds, it's true that the answer should be no. The only problem that we have in the monetary union is business cycle asymmetries, and the fact that you have a potentially different structural trend should not be a problem from a theoretical problem. Although maybe indeed we could have a problem if there is hysteresis, and this is linked to the debate on secular stagnation, and maybe this is an important point that we're going to see maybe with countries like Greece, Spain, etc. But I think the reason I would say I would answer yes to this question is not on purely economic grounds. It's really on the political economy side, and here it's a bit different from Elie. Is that I think that structural convergence is in fact completely necessary, and this is related to our first panel, if we want to have an ambitious fiscal union and an ambitious insurance mechanism to absorb asymmetric shocks. If you don't have structural convergence, it's going to be extremely difficult to get it, and due to political economy problems. So let me start with two facts, which I think are amply demonstrated by the crisis. The no bailout, no transfer rules are not credible. And the second fact is that large permanent, and this is the reason why it's linked to structural divergence, large permanent transfers are not politically acceptable in the EU. And that's clearly in contrast with the US, or was in contrast with the monetary union when we had it in France and Germany. You can have large permanent TFP differences across regions. You still have politically acceptable large transfers in these monetary unions, but this is not the case, I think, in the EU today. And so in the Eurozone, I think the big issue is that the no default rule is clearly not credible. We see today that a country with a risk of exit or a risk of default, because of the collateral damage on other members, can extract some transfers because of this collateral damage, and clearly this is the story, I think, a bit of Greece, up to a certain point, and maybe we've reached this point today. So we know that transfers are going to be exposed efficient to avoid an exit and to avoid a default, a sovereign default, and so these transfers are not the no bailout and no transfer rules are not credible. So the problem of structural divergence comes now because it means that you're going to have, if you have structural divergence, you're going to have structural divergence in particular in GDP per capita. We know that you're going to have more incentive to default if indeed if you have a lower GDP per capita in the long term. And so that means that given this incentive, higher incentive to default, that's going to mean that you're going to have these exposed transfers. And the risk of default, which is larger if you have convergence, real divergence, sorry, is not going to be paid by higher interest rates, and that's what we had in many of the countries, in the periphery countries in the 2000s. Why? Because indeed you have these expected transfers, exposed transfers. So the problem is that these transfers, I think, cannot go on, and in some sense, I think we're seeing, in some sense, the limit of this approach, and that's because we don't have political integration and political solidarity. So here, I think that's the link between this panel and the first one, is that if you have structural divergence, politically, I think we cannot put into place an insurance mechanism because that's not an insurance mechanism, that's a transfer mechanism, and that means we know the direction of transfers. So I think that structural convergence is a prerequisite to have an insurance mechanism, and an insurance mechanism is itself a prerequisite for the stability of the monetary union. So that would be my political economy thinking about this, and I think that's important, and that means that all the discussions we had in the first panel are very much based on the assumption that we're going to have structural convergence. Otherwise, I think all these discussions are going to be politically extremely difficult. One more point. I don't know how much time I have, but just okay. I think that means also if we have structural divergence plus this political impossibility to have permanent transfers, that means that we're going to, and that's exactly what we see today, we're going to overburden the ECB that has to substitute to easy governments, European Eurozone governments, because there's, and we see it in some countries and core countries actually, some resistance to expose efficient transfers to avoid default or exit. And today I think that it is the core countries, Germany, France, and some other countries, which overburden the ECB, and they are the ones who put a risk of fiscal dominance on the ECB. So just how? So if I want to quick points, and clearly on structural convergence there are many issues. One, I think there will be no structural convergence, especially for peripheral countries, and Greece at first, if you don't have large debt restructuring. We know that the debt overhang problem is looming large on the issue of Greece, so I don't think that there will be structural reforms. There will not be long-term growth in Greece without debt restructuring. And in some sense, economic history, hundreds of experiences tell us exactly this. I've said about this thing about financial discipline. I think macroprudential policy is part of structural convergence, because without macroprudential policy, we're going to re-experiment some of the things we've seen in Spain and in Ireland, where because of banks doing crazy things, in fact, unit labor costs are going to diverge. Third thing is capital markets union. I think that's an important thing, because I think one of the things we've learned in the empirical literature of the past 10, 20 years is that to get higher TFP, total factor productivity, it's not that all firms increase their productivity, it's that you have reallocation of capital and labor from sectors which are low productivity to sectors which are high productivity, and inside sectors between firms which are low productivity to firms which are high productivity. And here that means clearly a big overhaul of the financial system in Europe. And from that point of view, I think capital markets union can help. And lastly, just a point, I think, yeah, I do agree that competitiveness councils are a good starting point. I mean, it's clearly not enough, but I think this is something important in the sense that it has to be understood in all countries that competitiveness is not only a matter of the exporters, it's a matter of all public policies, it's a matter of the service industry, etc., etc. And so that all public policy, housing, for example, are a big issue for competitiveness and therefore structural convergence. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Let me just quiz you on one point you made where I guess 95% of my compatriots would disagree. I think they would agree with basically everything that you said except for one point, and so I'm asking you that point. You said we need debt restructuring for structural convergence, and perhaps you so perhaps you can enlarge a little bit on that point. I mean, what exactly do you mean, and what is the mechanism you have in mind there? I mean, are you saying that the debt restructuring is necessary for any growth to return, or are you saying only with the debt restructuring there will be an incentive for countries to get their house in order and ensure that there's new industry, or what exactly is the mechanism you have in mind here?
It's a very classical debt overhang mechanism, and it's both private investors and government investing in structural reforms. If you know that whatever the benefits of growth you're going to get is going to be taken by an increase in the price, in the value of sovereign debt, which is becoming less risky because growth is higher, that means it's a big tax on investment in those countries, and it's a big tax on the benefits of structural reforms. I mean, I'm not saying something original, it's extremely, it's something that we've seen all over in many other countries, and that's the reason why the IMF knows and says we need that restructuring.
Yeah, I think the answer of a German economist will be that once you do the debt restructuring, we go back to the old way of doing business, namely not reforming, but rather living on the basis of credit, I mean, and external funds. But anyway, so Jean-Michel.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Guntram. What I would like to put to you briefly is, in a nutshell, the following idea. I'm not sure whether structural convergence is a prerequisite for a successful monetary union, but what does seem to me fairly clear after 15 years now, even 20 rather than 15, is that there's been a whole series of major misunderstandings as to what is meant by structural convergence. I'll try to explain briefly. The definition of the structural convergence has changed a lot over time. And in fact, there have been three phases prior to the euro, so the end of the 90s, 2000, 2007, and then after the recession. And the series of misunderstandings and what you call miscommunication by various politicians, commission or whatever, about what is meant by structural convergence means that today we have lost public opinion. They're no longer in favor of the European project. And miraculously, at the end of last year, there was fortunate alignment of the planets, and without that, we would have been in another recession. And I think public opinion would be even more unfavorable than it is today, because thanks to low oil prices, strong and weaker euro, things are picking up a little, but it's been concealed. I mean, those factors are concealing down on the problem. Misunderstanding. Why do I say that? Well, in the period up to the euro, when we were ramping up for the euro, Maastricht, and then everything that followed towards building the euro, what public opinion was told was an ambitious project. It was about building a unified Europe with a single currency and a certain amount of convergence of living standards, GDP per capita, welfare, well-being in general. So it would be a sort of special haven in the world where people would have higher living standards, but fairly homogenized living standards. So that was the target shown. At the same time, of course, we needed indicators to match, to track the convergence, and to a certain extent they were derived from the lessons learned from the failure of the snake. So he took two, I'm talking about this phase prior to the euro, inflation and public deficit in countries that had one, so that in 1999, we would allow in a certain number of countries that had fairly well converged in terms of public deficit and inflation. If you look at that period in the 90s, it's true there was a certain amount of labor productivity convergence among the founding countries of the euro, and capital density increased in countries that were then called peripheral later. Now, once the Eurozone was up and running itself, once the euro was actually being used, there was a change in the way structural convergence between countries was presented. And it was presented in a rather concrete and attractive way that was probably in line with what the Founding Fathers, one of whom spent time here, thought of. There's the European 2020 goals. I'll briefly go through them because so far nobody's mentioned them, and I think it would be worthwhile to look back and see what they were, are, and perhaps will be. So convergence of employment rates in the 20 to 60-year age group. So I'll switch to English now.
From now, got a kind of 5 years actually, got a bit of time. Second, convergence in terms of an increase in the share of R&D in GDP, which should for all countries be above 3%. And third, a significant drop in school dropout rates, in the poverty rate, and in greenhouse gas emissions. That's all in the 2020 Charter at the time, okay? But en réalité, ce qui se passe entre 2000 et 2007, c'est que...
Back to French. When you take these different indicators, and they were looked at quite closely in various reports, one of which was produced in 2014 by the French National Bank and goes into quite a lot of detail, you can see there's a huge difference, a divergence, growing divergence between these countries. And if there is any convergence, it's just through massive transfer of capital north to south to fund a certain number of non-productive sectors. Everyone knows real estate, for example, which is why bubbles were created. And this wasn't visible up until 2007, thanks to the ECB. And I say this because Mr. Trichet isn't here, but also because I'm not pointing the finger. It's just the perception of financial markets of the time was that there is a monetary zone, so all of the countries that had the necessary credit worthiness, or because they were all AAA, roughly speaking, if they weren't really, but that made them AAA. So compressed spreads and looks like convergence, but it wasn't really Europe 2020 convergence. It was spread convergence, which was completely different, of course. Then you get the third period after the recession. And here, convergence and its definition changed again. And basically, it was about focusing on competitiveness, and that's what we have today. Convergence, structural convergence, is about competitiveness. That's the measure of it. So when you take the whole of the Eurozone, that might seem a bit paradoxical, Because I remind you that in 2014, if we take the Eurozone, current payments had a surplus of about 0.5% of the global GDP, which is very close to China's performance in 2008. So that being so, to talk about a competitiveness problem seems a bit strange. Certainly, if you take the monetary zone, rather than competitiveness, you can say there's a problem of allocation between investment and savings, with not enough investment, too much savings, perhaps more so in some countries than others. And if we're talking about a Eurozone, you're talking about the overall position of that area. And so misallocation of savings and investment was huge. And this desire for competitive disinflation, which is a bit provocative as a term, but it emerged at the time of the crisis. So where deficit countries in the Eurozone, as to say, where the deficit still counted, those countries opted for competitive disinflation, which led to surpluses. So it shows that it was quite successful. But at the end of the day, the surplus in the Eurozone as a whole is much greater. We're the largest exporters of capital in the world, which is nice for everyone else, but not necessarily what was originally intended. And I say this because, I mean, it's, well, not because everything went wrong, no. European monetary policy succeeded in being very protective. And since 2000, in particular 2007, if that hadn't been the case, we wouldn't be talking about the Eurozone. We'd still be talking about francs, etc. So I think you can say that that was very successful as an umbrella and to enhance credibility. But I know we're here not just to we're here to analyze, but not to make proposals. So we are not like doctors. We can't deliver a diagnosis or give specific recommendations. So I will just make do with his sayings of come back to this 2020 agenda, Europe 2020, and specifically see what was in it. I was talking about it just now, in particular R&D, sporting innovation, and the convergence of employment rates across countries. Now, I think that necessarily means there have to be very specific measures that set precedents. And in my view, the only thing that can be really effective today, if anything can, I think it can, is just like in law over centuries, you've had case law, setting jurisprudence. I think as some specific, if rather modest measures can recreate a dynamic within Europe that would enable us to get back to targets that will once again lead to ownership by the public opinion, which would mean ownership in terms of the European project as such. Let me give you some examples. In France, we allowed businesses to amortize in a shorter period. It only represents a small amount of total investment, but it's still an attractive idea. But it's only happening in France. Why not do the same sort of thing across all European countries? Because studies have shown fairly indisputably that there'll be a multiplier effect. Even if you take a modest measure at the same time, it'll be more effective than taking one after the other. There's the Juncker plan that can be accused of being too restrictive, too small, but it seems to me the ideas are attractive if they were implemented very quickly and if they were better funded, as they're using new Commission money rather than reallocating what had been previously committed. So a few ideas of that sort with the necessary communication that seems to me vital on communicating with public opinion so as to connect with them. Again, I think that is the most vital short-term issue. We need to reconnect with people in Europe so that European people buy into the European project.
Well, I also have a follow-up question for you, and to do so, I want to refer to the rating more specifically, if I may. As you remember, France was recently put from stable to negative on October 10, 2014. In your rating, and the reasons you give is, you say, basically the nominal and the real growth prospect of France has deteriorated. So since you're not saying what is the medicine, but you're assessing the situation, I was wondering to what extent you think the structural divergence between France and Germany has become already so big that the things that Philippe Martin mentioned in terms of the political economy. I mean, you need structural convergence to be able to agree on some form of, deeper fiscal integration. That this divergence has become already too big. I mean, after all, you have just downgraded, or at least put France on a negative watch. So I was wondering, how serious is that?
Ouais, je pense que comparer.
Well, I think comparing France and Germany from that viewpoint is probably not the right way to go, because the long-term problems in the two countries, for obvious demographic reasons, are different. It's perfectly understandable that to a certain extent Germany, as a sort of a large retirement home, would attract a high surplus. A household that's near retirement is going to accumulate assets. I'm not criticizing that. That's just a normal demographic process. Although one should also point out that Germany has been doing very well in terms of immigration. They're to be lauded there. France is different. Our demographics are, if anything, more favorable than in Germany. Therefore, we need to ensure there's a certain level of growth. We don't really have so much an issue with the surplus. The real difference between the two countries is more in terms of specialization, and I'm very tempted to hand over to Ellie, who has produced a really good paper on specialization and the dropping quality and in value added in France compared with certain competitors. In a nutshell, I don't think 1,000 cow farms are going to make us competitive with Eastern European agriculture, because agri-food was one area in which we were outstanding. So this idea of industrial specialization is very much at the heart of France's poor performance, in particular when compared with Germany, much more than anything else. For me, that's the nub of it. That's why France's value added has slipped closer to Spain or even Poland than Germany.
Those points.
Just on this, so I'm going to advertise just something I just wrote on by the Conseil d'analyse économique on competitiveness with Maria Beas, Lionel Fontanier, and Thierry Meyer. So we go back on this issue of non-price competitiveness and quality divergence. I think so indeed there is divergence from that point of view, and it's linked to some price competitiveness divergence in the
en termes de compétitivité des prix au début des années 2000. parce que les entreprises avaient peu de marge, n'étaient pas en mesure de faire de la R&D, de l'innovation. Donc, il y a clairement une complémentarité entre la concurrentialité des prix et la concurrentialité non fondée sur les prix. Il y a un point sur lequel nous...
as close as possible and at the very micro level, this issue of non-price competitiveness is that it's not that France diverged from Germany on quality. It's Germany that really is really different from all others. If you look at quality, our measures of quality, yes, France is not so bad in terms of, we find that on average, France, in terms of non-price competitiveness, which is measure of quality, if you want, at a very large level, is number 7 in terms at the OECD. So it's not so bad. But it's Germany, which is completely different from the other OECD countries, and which has increased tremendously, and which is number 1 of the OECD, and by very far. So I think you have to be a little bit careful. And in France, of course, we're completely obsessed with the comparison with Germany, and we understand why. But we have to be a little bit careful. It's Germany which has been very successful, and from that point of view, actually, in the 2000s, what we find is that the increase in market shares of Germany was mostly due not really to an improvement in price competitiveness, but in non-price competitiveness. So from that point of view, we often accuse Germany of being non-cooperative during this period. In fact, yes, they did the right thing. But again, it's Germany which has in some sense diverged, and not in terms of price competitiveness, but in non-price competitiveness.
Ce qui est frappant quand on étudie...
When you look at France and compare it with Germany and Nordic countries, it's striking in one sense that we don't have the costs of our costs and our specialization don't match, and what's happened is that our costs have continually risen and our specialization has diminished continually. And when you have higher and higher costs, but you are becoming less and less specialized, there's price and non-price loss of competitiveness. So I think it's much more than just cost or non-cost competitiveness, and it is something that's been going on for the last 30 years.
Y a-t-il des commentaires, des questions dans la salle ou de la part des autres participants?
Okay, if I may. I mean, there are good reasons to take a close look at France and Germany, but here we're talking about the whole of the Eurozone. So I think the first question is, have we started endogenous mechanisms that make it much harder to have balance in the Eurozone? We all remember the controversial discussion about what would happen as a result of monetary integration, agglomeration, asymmetry, and a risk that this would be very difficult to correct. It seems to me that the conditions of entry into the Eurozone, so over-competitive Germany that was restructuring and defining the value chain, and then Southern Europe with a very favorable, apparently favorable position with the low interest rates. All of that probably compounded phenomena that were going to happen with the medium term. The question is, what are the conditions for rebalancing over and above what we've seen to date? Because there are a number of countries that returned to balance foreign trade situations, but it's about a huge reallocation of resources from tradable and non-tradable goods under conditions that make it possible to restore full employment in Southern Europe, but with the constraint, apart from debt restructuring, the constraint of foreign debt, which is very strong, because the levels are around 100% of GDP. And of course, this raises the question of we should fund new deficits or not, unless, of course, that would be through investments. So it seems to me that the question is, there is an answer, which is what Philip was saying. The answer is to have structural debt relief, so reset at zero. With all the objections that might lead to, the question is what is the range of instruments we consider? Should we perhaps much more favor capital market union, equity flows Southern Europe? But that's part of the answer, maybe. Should we have public support mechanisms in investment, for example? Should we rethink the role of the EIB and other bodies with policies that would be much more focused? Well, I didn't say that debt restructuring was inadequate. I said it was absolutely necessary, but it's not adequate.
Back to the debate you were having and Philippe. In fact, on those basically, they are like you have three different sources for divergence. The first one is the one that Reza mentioned, like fiscal indiscipline, that has led to a misallocation of capital. The second one is the divergence in unit labor costs that was mentioned in Guntram's paper, and for which we have a solution, which is like fiscal council, fiscal competitiveness council. And for Reza's problem, we have basically the banking union and European supervision. But for this one, okay, you mention it, and it's interesting because you explore it further. About divergence, maybe due to agglomeration effect, due to specialization, but because also all of this maybe come from basically economies of scale or clustering effect. In the end, it makes, so it could be due in the end to the existence of the single market, that is coupled with the existence of the monetary union. Both of them would basically lead to this clustering effect. So in a way, it would make the European economy and the Eurozone economy as a whole more efficient. So in a way, what's the solution? Because basically, yeah, you have this clustering effect, and in the US there are huge clustering effect. You have one Hollywood, one financial market, which is in New York, one place where you do a startup, which is in the Silicon Valley. So what do we do? Do we need to go against those agglomeration effects, and do we need to compensate for them through transfers, or should we really do something to avoid them risking to make the European economy as a whole less efficient? What do you think about that?
That's a very good question. Now, when you look at the details, what you see when it comes to agglomeration effect is that you've got economic polarization, but also growing specialization between branches and products that's much more detailed and subtle. In other words, it's not just about factors such as concentration of the car industry in Germany, relative decline of the same industry in France. You have specialization in particular segments, so within certain industrial branches, whereby the effect of accelerated integration has led to much finer specialization. The issue is that for countries that need to balance their balance of payments, is there a situation where their tradable goods sector contracts such that they reach structural deficit? What I tried to say by way of answer is that I think some countries, in particular France, we've gone much too far in this process of inappropriate specialization, and we've ended up in such a narrow corridor that we can't achieve balance. And I think there's a whole range of things that should be done when it comes to structural reforms in order to give the system a boost again. And Jean was making some proposals just now about what we could do at European level. I believe much more in national solutions. I think our social tax system is hugely inappropriate, and that's a French problem. We have to make major efforts to have a much more suitable social tax system that would allow a more virtuous development cycle of French competitiveness. So I'm not saying that I'm challenging the idea of specialization and polarization. It's just that we should grow more the capabilities in a system that I think is more atrophied by a number of constraints that over time have become hugely counterproductive. Okay, but if Ohio wanted to bring back banks, could they have a different tax system? No, it's too late for that, and this is the situation France is in, surely. You cannot get the country back to France now because there are synergies with the supply chain in Germany and Eastern Europe, and you don't have that in France anymore. Now, I'm not talking about bringing business back, but you know that industrial activity and business in general is permanently regenerating. There are new developments, new technologies, new businesses, and I think that using those as building blocks, whether it be services, or smart networks, or whatever, we build a system again, and we should have a more favorable terrain for that. I'm not talking about bringing back some car production line in the factory.
Concentrate on France, so let's not talk about France. But let me, and I think we agree on this with Elie, I'm all for agglomeration benefits and clustering. I do believe, and there's a lot of empirical work showing that clustering is good because it increases the productivity of firms through labor market efficiency, through technological spillovers, economies of scale, etc. So clearly it's good. I think on the experience that I don't think we should take as granted that monetary unification has generated divergence in terms of, or agglomeration. I'm not sure that the empirical literature on this is so clear. And for example, or in the US, if you look at what has happened, we know that, yes, indeed, there are clusters of high technology in certain regions, but we know also in the past 10, 15 years that there's been a lot of relocation of industry in regions with which were not clearly industrial clusters initially. So the idea from a theoretical point of view is quite, we can be agnostic, and there's a lot of theoretical literature on this, and it's not clear. And my take on this is that actually, if you take the look at the shape of agglomeration as a function of integration, monetary integration, trade integration, etc., it's more like a inverse U shape. So maybe indeed we need to go further. And in terms also of what has happened in terms of clustering, I think that there's been a lot of clustering inside countries. That's quite clear. Inter-country, it's not completely obvious that it is linked to some real integration. It's linked, I think, much more to the issue of financial follies of the 2000s, which have generated a big increase in unit labor cost in Spain, in Ireland, etc., etc. So I think this is the problem. These are macroeconomic problems, and we need for that macroprudential policies, etc., etc.
Philippe Martin sur
Philippe Martin, you talked about the need to have convergence before risk sharing was introduced. You said it was a prerequisite. It's true, there's no point in having an insurance system until risks are pretty much the same. And at the moment, We have 25% or 20% unemployment in Spain, much less in Germany. So we see the problems that this creates, but at the same time, basically what my question is, how far should we converge so as to have integration? Because when you're talking about doing it step by step, the idea seems to be that national preferences will have to be changed, you need reforms. So you're asking people to make an effort, and you're saying, no worries, make an effort, but there's going to be solidarity to support you. How does that work? Because it's very difficult to ask people to make an effort for some indefinite period, but at the end of the day, you'll have integration. So doing it step by step, to me, seems, politically speaking, problematic.
No, I agree. This is a good point. And maybe, I mean, when I say it's a prerequisite, I think I can think of also a grand bargain, where we go towards more fiscal union in exchange of more structural reforms. That's a hard one, and clearly I'm not thinking of a sequence where, you know, it's not before we converge that we get insurance mechanism. I think that both have to go at the same time, because otherwise, again, politically, it's not going to go to have an ambitious insurance mechanism. So we need to do progress on both fronts at the same time.
Okay, there's one, Reza, sorry, there's one there, and then no question in the. Okay, sorry. Then Reza, would you like to inject?
Just a couple of points. I think, obviously, given the crisis of the last 5 years, people focus a lot on the Eurozone. I think it is also probably good to think of the wider EU. And second point, and I'll try and relate the two. If one looks at some of the reforms in the last few years, I think you can also see success stories. I think we are all of us are obsessed with Greece. But I think if you were looking, and I remember being involved in the discussions 3 years ago on how can Spain switch from having 18% of its GDP generated in the construction sector with a massive current account deficit. How can it switch? I think you would feel very depressed about the prospects. Now, that has happened. Not been easy, but it has happened. So, but let me bring the two points together. I think if you look at the wider EU, I think one has to look at competitiveness and competitive advantage in a much broader sense. For example, and in particular, supply chain very much goes across countries right now. And so the idea of sector specialization or clusters in individual countries probably is an outdated idea if one looks at the wider EU and comparative advantage. For example, the countries of Central Europe are much more connected to Germany than Southern Europe are. And the question is, why is that? Part of it is geography, for sure. But part of it is also comparative advantage and competitiveness in certain areas. And so I think, to me, all of this means that reforms do pay at the end of the day. If you look at the structure of the Spanish society and why it has been able to adjust, Spain has had, for example, a much more open attitude to product markets in the past, and they have been forced through the crisis to do labor market reforms. So the conditions for job generation and employment growth are better, and you see that Ocon coefficient changes after the crisis, job creation, the speed of job creation changes. So I think one should not be too pessimistic about prospects of countries to change, but I think one also needs to be realistic that at the end of the day, price competition, and whether it's in the product market, the labor market, does matter. And I think if one addresses that, it is possible to improve competitiveness. So some countries, unfortunately, have a much longer way to go than others, but I think I do also see some positive movement in terms of what Europe has. And let's not forget, Europe has the biggest current account surplus in the world right now. So it's, it causes international macroeconomic problems, but it also shows a degree of overall competitiveness in the goods market.
All right. If there's no further question, I would give the floor back for each of you for one or two concluding remarks, and then we close actually right on time. But let me see whether there's. Vincent, yes.
Peut-être une dernière question, enfin ou en tout cas une question.
Maybe one last question or one additional question. You said that the problems of competitiveness and the responses to them are cross-cutting, transversal, according to the panel, talking about tax reform in France or production costs. So don't you think that there's room for mechanisms that are more direct? John Pisani was talking about the IB. Here in Europe, don't you think you also need more effective direct measures to support regions, for example, because polarization is more within states, but we know that there are regions where people are disappearing. Don't you think there's something that European authorities can do, either through the IB or something else?
Pascal?
Maybe. Just to pick up on something that Jean-Michel said quite rightly just now, namely that pan-European targets, Eurozone, if you like, and targets have to be understandable, accessible to public opinion. Those people who can create such targets are not economists, because you can say that divergence is not good, convergence is right. That doesn't mean anything politically. And so I'll come back to what he said and take it a bit further. Namely that whatever ideas we might have regarding integration of the Eurozone, for all the excellent reasons that eminent economists can show, all that can only be a subset of a set of political objectives, environment, energy transition or something, things that interest people, and show that if we do it together, it will be more successful than if we go it alone. That is the basic premise of European construction. So whatever you as economists decide on, upstream from that, there has to be something that speaks to the public. It's because we want to do this, because it's good for everybody, that we have to do this other thing. Now, for various reasons, I remember how the internal market in 1985 was announced. The narrative wasn't about economics at all. There was a Cicchini report, it's true, which was absolute nonsense for any serious economist. I know, because I did the numbers on the back of an envelope, because we were in a hurry. But we came up with an economic narrative that was accepted. We knew that there were costs for Europe, but we were able to explain. And I think it's something that simple. You know, whatever you come up with, and I hope you will and we will, you have to remember that it has to be made palatable in a way, has to be packaged in a way that creates legitimacy, doesn't destroy it.
Merci, thank you. Of course, I would be curious to have your particular idea and vision that you would put forward. I mean, what do you think would be the kind of common project that would appeal to citizens at this stage? I think I do completely concur with you that kind of this narrative, you know, where do we want to go in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? That's the thing that is missing at the moment, and I think we're all searching a bit for it, but you know, the kind of the post-war narrative doesn't work anymore really. The globalization narrative is, you know, perhaps so natural for most of us that, you know, we don't even think of it in European terms. So if you have a good idea, I would be very happy to hear it. Okay, let me also see whether there's another question, comment, remark. Otherwise, let me go back to all the panelists. You want to start, Jean-Michel?
Alphabetical order.
Yeah, reverse alphabetical order.
Exactly. No, I think that, you know, I'll be very short. I think indeed that what Pascal Lamy was kind to express in very clear terms is really what I think. And indeed, this narrative reminds me of this. The other thing that was quite nice back in the 80s when we had the Milky Way, la Voie lactée de Jacques Delors, qui était cette zone qui devait partir de Londres, passer par Amsterdam, descendre sur la Ruhr.
It was supposed to cover Amsterdam, the Ruhr, Milan, etc. And that included a lot of countries with various clusters that were cross-fertilizing all the way through. And there was something that was well received. If we look at that Milky Way type of thing today, it's not so clear. But there was a narrative. My point here is just that the Eurozone is a club with many members. Now, elsewhere, in some other forum, you might wonder whether maybe the membership hasn't expanded too quickly, but that's another issue. But I think that at this juncture, there's an objective for restoring growth and competitiveness, as you were saying. Philip and Elie know the idea of specialization, positioning on the value-added scale. Such initiatives, or for those objectives, I would say, could be very difficult to implement across the Eurozone for various reasons I won't go into. But I do come back to this idea of jurisprudence applied to economic goals that 2, 3, 4 countries maybe, or maybe more, could get together to harmonize initiatives, tax or regulatory or whatever, to launch product in France and Germany, France and Spain, France and Italy, etc. That would fairly quickly produce concrete results, quickly on a human scale. That sort of thing, I think, could give a new boost, a new dynamic that, in the longer term, would favor convergence, even though we haven't yet defined what that really means. And I think this would strengthen the European monetary zone, which is, I think, what everyone is hoping for here at this table.
So let me answer on regional policies. It seems to me we've done it for, what, 30, 35 years now, and it's not been a success. Huh? I think on this, the empirical studies are quite clear. I don't think we found the right policies. On the political objectives, sure, I completely agree. I mean, you criticize economists, and I think that more and more we do take into account some political constraints, and I think that's one reason that I think this idea of the unemployment insurance at the European level, I think, is indeed one of the objectives is exactly this. However, I think at some point saying it's not only a problem of narrative well, that was a little bit you were saying that, you know, we need a narrative to sell our ideas. I think that's that one big problem, and I think that was said, is that indeed there is a political backlash in Europe today against European integration, and I don't think it's only a problem of narrative. It's also that there is really backlash against look at trade integration at a more global level. So I think we have to take this into account too.
Let me just carry on along those lines. I think there's fairly broad consensus on the idea that the European project needs to be continued as a response to the widely shared perception of the relative decline of individual European nations and peoples. The idea of diminished expectations, that different nation states are not up to it anymore, that creates a sort of overall climate where there is a feeling that a joint response is required. The thing is that joint response hasn't been translated into achievable intermediary goals, achievable by countries and the Eurozone. I'm thinking of the various attempts over recent years in the energy sector, R&D, combating unemployment. European targets have been selected that we can achieve more easily together than separately, but it hasn't really worked out. So I'm less ambitious. And I'm thinking that if just 2 or 3 could get together to launch an initiative, that could set an example. Tax reform, for example, we were just talking about that. I think we need to work more specifically on tax convergence between France and Germany. There are other examples. Hoping, of course, that this will have a snowball effect. Maybe I'm being excessively restricted in my ambition, but that's how I see things now.
Okay, I think we've had a very rich discussion. I think it's difficult to conclude it and summarize it, but certainly I took away that this remains a key issue. The issue of structural convergence should remain a key issue and is a key issue of monetary union. How do we achieve it? We've had some ideas here. I think we will all have to do some more thinking in this, but I'm very glad that we had this panel, and I would like to thank all of you for your rich contribution to this discussion. So I think it's time to conclude the overall conference. There's a cocktail reception, a closing reception, but no wrap-up. So Jean, do you want to wrap up or to just invite to the closing? Okay, good. Thank you.